We ought to have richer foods, richer films. I thought I would make this kind of film, entertaining enough to eat, as it were. Now, those words from Akira Kurosawa, the director and co-writer of this film, I quoted those words at the beginning of a talk to some film students on the 30th anniversary of Seven Samurai's release. It is now the 70th anniversary. A story that is worth telling about this film relates to another of its writers, Shinobu Hashimoto, and he was invited once to a film school in Russia, and he was invited to speak about his work with Kurosawa. And Hashimoto was a little surprised and had to ask, "Oh, you've seen Seven Samurai in Russia?" And the answer he got back was, there is common to the curriculum of every decent filmmaking school one film, and that film is Seven Samurai. Well, the slightly shifting place of Seven Samurai in the canon of world cinema is something I'm going to discuss as this commentary moves through. But there's no question that Seven Samurai is an awesome film. It's a great film by any objective standard. And I think one of the best ways to go at the film and understanding the film is to really look at it as an incredible masterclass in cinema, in filmmaking, in the craft of filmmaking, and of course the art of filmmaking. So my particular focus in this commentary for the British Film Institute is I'm not going to go over some material that's easily found elsewhere, reports on the production of the film. I'm not going to go through the career of every main actor who appears on screen. You can find that information easily elsewhere. I'm going to look as closely as I can at the sort of moment-to-moment construction of this film. And of course I'll be bringing in some other issues more generally, some more historic factors of film culture and world culture that help us to understand this movie. Well, something that's already gone by is the credits, and the credits give you a sense of something that virtually every account of Seven Samurai says, which is that it's a dynamic film. And even the credits, the graphic construction of the credits, one name sort of tilted against another, gives you the first sign of that dynamism from the word go. These early shots in the film are unusual because there's really no other shots like them. We have this very dramatic sort of black silhouettes against the sky, and the characters we're looking at are the villains. They're the brigands, the gang of unlovely guys who are going to attack this village that we're seeing from their point of view here. Those very early shots of them riding in that black silhouette fashion, this is a clear reference, it seems to me, to a director that Kurosawa really admired, which was John Ford. And particularly the more expressionistic, the more intensely contrasted, black and white, highly pictorial element of John Ford's American films. Now, after a few shots, that style disappears from the film, and we go into a slightly more naturalistic register. It's not really correct to call this film naturalistic or realistic, even though in fact there is a lot of realistic detail in it, and in the entire production design, in the costume and so on. But it would be more accurate to say that Kurosawa and his collaborators sort of raised this film not so much to the level of mythology, but of legend. And we'll come back later to the very important role of pre-existing legends of the samurai, how important they were to the writing, the script writing of the film. Now there were for some long years different versions, different cuts of this film. Of course, only one full cut, which is the cut we're watching, of course, only one cut authorised by Kurosawa. But the studio that produced Toho decided at the time, 1954, that a shorter version should play outside of the metropolitan centres of Japan, and that was cut by some 40 minutes. And then there were even shorter cuts which appeared in various markets around the world. Now, I haven't seen those shorter cuts, but undoubtedly some of the material that was snipped from those had to do with these characters we're being introduced to now. The villagers. The villagers who, of course, we've seen in a very economical touch that one of the villagers has overheard the marauding brigands sort of planning out their attack and when they'll do it. And so we have a long introduction to essentially the internal politics of this farming community. Now, this is a very, very important scene in so many ways. And look at a shot like this, the circular arrangement, which would seem to imply, if one just saw a still of it, would seem to imply a certain togetherness, a certain belonging, a certain unity of this community. But in fact, look what Kurosawa does in his mise-en-scène, in his staging. Staging is always a matter with him, not only of figures in the frame and objects and landscapes in the frame, but also the movements in and out of the frame and the way the cutting, the decoupage, the editing kind of works with that. This is part of the genius of Kurosawa as a filmmaker. And so what we're getting here are these breakaway movements. We have the sort of central figure for our attention among the villagers is the character of Rikichi, played by Yoshio Tsuchiya. And he breaks away from the group, then the group has to reform around him, as it were. There's a point of tension, there's a possible point of resolution, over and over again. This is something which is a pattern in the film. No filmmaker was more obsessed with patterns, with symmetries, with repetition and variation, repetition with a difference. No one was more obsessed with that than Kurosawa. He really was a master at building a film on these sort of step-by-step, sort of incremental repetitions and differences of a situation or of a movement or of a configuration of bodies, of people in a group, and so on. Now, what we see happening among the farmers at the start of the film, this kind of togetherness and then conflict and then partial resolution, a constant forming and reforming of a group, is of course what the whole film will dramatise. And not only, of course, among the farmers, but also among the samurai, who we've yet to get to, and all of the relations between the farmers and the samurai, which is in many ways the central subject of the film. The relationship between the two classes of farmers and samurai. This is something we'll go into in quite a bit of detail as the film goes on. Okay, at this moment we've been introduced to the figure of Gisaku, who is the elder of this community, played by Kokuten Kodo. He's a formidable old guy, as you can see. Kurosawa loves to give him these shots where straight on to his face, sort of, and he's looking, as it were, into the camera, but it's a kind of a blind look, not literally is he blind, but it's this sort of look where he's totally inside himself and his own somewhat ironic wisdom. Okay, they need samurai. They need hungry samurai, as Gisaku counsels them. So then we get very famous Kurosawa moment. These characters, who are samurai, walking in the main thoroughfare of some village. The way he shoots and cuts that, the camera following them, the sort of restless cutting between one figure and another, this is one of the main ways that Kurosawa gives dynamism to the film. It also has a slightly comical effect. As the Iranian film critic Farrokh Ghaffari said back in 1957 in an essay on Kurosawa for Positif magazine, the French magazine, as Ghaffari says, these samurai who we observe at the start of the film and at other moments seem to do nothing but walk up and down the street, as it were. And that seems to be their main activity. So it quickly transpires that it's not going to be easy to recruit samurai for this mission. They need a certain kind of samurai. Some samurai, their price is too high, others are too proud. It's not the kind of work they want to do. Now, what we're getting here is an early indication of the historical situation of the samurai. That they're these sort of wandering, itinerant figures in legend and in history. They're the Ronin. They're the sort of wandering warriors. They no longer have, as it were, a boss. They no longer have a mission. They no longer have a place. As is often said in the dialogue, they no longer have a castle. Right? They're no longer in the employ of some feudal warlord. So this is an extremely important point of history and of historical culture that informs Seven Samurai. That these samurai are wandering, and also they've broken down, as it were, into different kinds of behaviour. Some of them, indeed, have become the brigands, the villains. This is very important to realise in Seven Samurai, that the villains are also samurai, as it were, fallen samurai. And that when our heroic samurai sort of do battle with those bad guys, in a sense it's the samurai class cancelling or extinguishing itself. The remnants of this, as it were, once glorious samurai world, this samurai class, it's all in disarray. And to think of Kurosawa in 1954 making a film about a society that is in disarray on many levels, somewhat in ruins, that'll of course make you think of the historical situation of Japan after the defeat of Japan in the Second World War, after the American occupation. And the film is not a heavy allegory of the present moment of 1954, but definitely there's an ambience in the film, that there is some correspondence, a loose correspondence between the time in which Kurosawa made the film and the time that he is dramatising. By the way, here, let's note that we have another kind of social class when we look at these rather rough-looking characters who you'll often see referred to as coolies, the English word coolies, which means they are these sort of, almost subterranean kind of labour force who are not farmers. They're also these sort of wandering people looking for work, for whatever work they can get. But of course, they're not samurai. They're further down the social chain. So you see the carefulness with which Kurosawa and his writers sort of construct these levels of social class or social place, and the differences between them, and the sort of ever shifting relationships between these characters. Now let's say something here about the overall narrative structure of Seven Samurai. Of course, we've yet to get to the Seven Samurai. We've yet to be introduced to them. We have this long introductory section, this exposition section, which sets up the plight of the farmers, their despair. It sets up the solution they come up with, the possible solution, which is to recruit samurai. And then we have the whole section which has to do with recruitment, this difficult act of recruitment. Now, what you are doubtless already getting a sense of is that this is a film that really takes its time with telling its story. And it's constructed in these sort of large pieces because we're not only going to get, for instance, recruitment of the samurai, we're then going to get a whole section to do with training of the villages, the, as it were, fortification of the village, the mapping out of all the ways in which the samurai intend to protect the village. We're going to have a lot of waiting before the attack, the final and eventual attack by the brigands. So this is a film which is going to give you these large blocks of story. According to the co-writer Hashimoto, in his very valuable book called Compound Cinematics, that I'll be referring to quite a bit in this commentary, as it gives you one of the most intriguing kind of inside views of the making, or at least the writing of this film. According to Hashimoto, the writing, and this happened on a number of Kurosawa projects, the writing proceeded in this extremely linear fashion from one scene to the next, with the three writers, Hashimoto, Kurosawa, and Hideo Oguni. They would be sitting together, they would be staying in a place together, and they would be writing every day, a very strict schedule. And according to Hashimoto, the question of the length of the script and therefore of the film was never discussed, even though it was sort of a mounting anxiety in Hashimoto's own mind, because the script is 50 pages, it's 100 pages, it's 150 pages, it's just growing and growing. And at no point did Kurosawa ever say, "Oh, this is a bit long," or, we have to think about restructuring what we've already done. So they worked in this linear fashion. The first draft had been provided by Hashimoto. Kurosawa would sort of rewrite sort of page by page, and Oguni's role was what was referred to by Hashimoto as the sort of control tower or command tower. He was kind of, in the modern parlance, a kind of script editor in the process, who would receive the pages sort of at the end of the table and would say, no, this is not good enough, or there's a problem here, or, oh, it's fine. And he himself would not write a single word. He would have this, as it were, outside perspective on the process. But that whole story is very revealing of the fact that that Kurosawa didn't come into this project with a sort of template of a feature film length, a normal feature film length in mind. The story had to have its own duration. It had to find its own duration and its own shape, and he remained completely true to that principle. They eventually did cut some things out of the script once it had been done, but of course they held to this very large scale narrative blocks, which is the essential sort of narrative form of the film. Now look at this shot here. This is so typical of Kurosawa. A shot is a cell where certain people move out of the frame. It's empty for a moment. Then another character enters. Now, very, very important. What have we got here? We've got this sort of very sideways, indirect introduction to two more of the samurai, apart from the central figure of Kanbei, who I'll discuss in a moment. But we've just had a quick introduction to the young Katsushiro and Kikuchio, played by Toshiro Mifune. Now, how did Kurosawa introduce them? He just brings them into the frame. You know, they either wander into the frame or they're found in the frame by the camera. And we have this sort of meaningful look here exchanged between Kikuchio and Kanbei. Why is that? There's actually no narrative reason for that, but it's very important that there is a link established between these two characters. And of course, because Kikuchio is going to eventually become one of the seven samurai. And you can see he's sort of forcing his way into situations, wants the best view, knocks over that barrel in order to get the best seat in the house. Now, this is the incredible introduction of Kanbei, played by Takashi Shimura, one of the greatest Kurosawa repertory team actors, as is Mifune. Now, what Kanbei, the character, stands for, more than anything, is the absolute ideal of the samurai. In some sense, in the whole course of the film, we might say the lost ideal of the true samurai, the selfless samurai. Now, he actually does sacrifice a part of himself. He has his top knot, shaved off and his head shaved so that he can disguise himself as a monk in this scene. And this scene is so brilliant. Firstly, because the way it plays on the off-screen, right? Kanbei dives into this hut, and that leads to this brilliant moment, one of the two moments of slow motion in the film, where this evil figure who has taken the child runs out of the hut. We don't really know what state he's in until, of course, he falls. And that play on the staticness or the slowness of the slow motion. We're in a moment between life and death. This is something that Kurosawa played on in many, many films. This sort of moment teetering between life and death, and between literally movement and stasis, stillness, which is, really what cinema is for Kurosawa, is the play of movement and stillness. And any way he can juice that, any way he can enhance that, the contrast, the sudden flux between movement and stillness, he'll do it. So, back to Kanbei. As I say, he's selfless. He's willing to disguise himself for the sake of that manoeuvre that he does. And this is another pattern in the film. There are moments of disguise. Kikuchio is going to do a wonderful moment of disguise and deceit much later in the film. Now, I want you to observe in this scene, we have this like fascinating sort of scenario of the road, of walking along the road. We have Kambei at the head. We have our villagers, Rikichi, the Yohei, played by Bokuzen Hidari, Manzo, played by Kamatari Fujiwara. We have the villagers following Kambei, sort of not yet, haven't yet got the courage to sort of ask him to do the work that they want to employ him for. We have Katsushiro, the young person who wants to be the protege, the disciple of Kambei. We have all these people following Kambei in different, as it were, variations of their movement, of their position on the road. This is, once again, a typical sort of Kurosawa situation. People moving, but not in a rigid formation, not in a fixed formation. This constant back and forth, one advances, drops back, another advances, and sort of takes the lead position. This moment here, where Katsushiro moves in front of Kambei, reminds me of some of the work that Kurosawa did in Ikiru, another film for which I've provided a commentary for the British Film Institute. In that even two people walking along the street can give rise to all kinds of mise-en-scène variations, one suddenly behind the other, one in front of the other, constant shifting of positions. Look at this fantastic frame where we have all of these sort of characters, stretched out down the path, down that road. And we have these tensions, sometimes of two people, sometimes of a triangle, as we're getting right now. Now, here is a very significant moment in the structure of the film, although it's easy, in fact, to forget that it happens. We have Kikuchio, basically asserting that he is a samurai, and Kambei's calm response, which is usually his response to many things, is this calmness, and his calm response is which is, a total dismissal of him. Now, basically, at this moment, which, of course, Mifune, as an actor, kind of milks for as much as he can get. In fact, Mifune milks every moment that he has in this film. We'll come back to his acting style, his performance in this film later. But this is a moment where the character of Kikuchio kind of disappears from the movie, and he'll be gone for quite a while, some 20 minutes. It's easy on a first-time viewing of the film to forget him at this point and to think, okay, he's been dismissed. That's the end of this colourful character that we briefly met. Because now the plot is going to go up a notch, and we enter this recruitment phase where it's Kambei sort of driving the recruitment process. He will be looking for people, and eventually he's going to introduce this idea of a test. And the test, in wonderful Kurosawa fashion, is completely physical. It has to do with Katsushiro standing at the door with a thing to sort of bash the samurai or the aspiring samurai as they enter the room. And we'll see, of course, that there's a series of variations that will be played on this game. Now, it's also important in the very gradual unfolding of the plot of Seven Samurai that even Kambei himself doesn't commit straight away. He needs time to think about it. He needs time to think of strategy, of how many they will need. You need 7 men, including myself, he says. And at some point he has to remind the villagers, look, I'm not in yet. You know, I haven't committed to this yet. I'm just thinking about it. So we get all of these portions of narrative in the film which have to do with thinking, with contemplating, with waiting. In many ways, the structure of the film is an alternation between sort of moments of waiting or of rest or of anticipation, which can be often, of course, very tense anticipation, and then action. Action, particularly in the form of the fighting and the eventual battle. Now, this is the structure of most of Kurosawa's films that have an action element. In some ways, you can see Kurosawa's career as moving between the types of stories that are more contemplative, and that is the case of Ikiru, the story of a man who has cancer, who knows he will die, who's trying to find some meaning in the last days, as it were, of his life, the last weeks of his life. We have that kind of story in Kurosawa. And then we have films that are based on action, on some form of violence, fighting, combat, action. Now, it has to be said that Kurosawa is absolutely one of the greatest action filmmakers in the world, in the history of cinema. No question about it. And it was partly the frisson he could give to action scenes has to do with all of this sort of waiting and dead time and expectation, anticipation around the action scenes. That's what really gives the action its power. It's never non-stop action unless it needs to be a section of a barrage of action, as we get in the very final battle of the film. But usually there's all this other kind of material sort of around the action scenes. And we're seeing here another classic scene of the film, which once again expresses the goodness of Kambei, the goodness of his soul, as it were, that he will share the rice which is the main thing that the villagers have got to attract the samurai, is that they can feed them this rice. Whereas we are told the villagers, will eat millet, which is another kind of grass-based grain, but their special rice, as it were, will be reserved for the samurai. Well, there'll be a twist on that later in the film, but for the moment, this is what we take in. But of course, Kambei is this selfless figure, and he is willing to sacrifice some of his own particular luxuries, as it were, for the sake of the villagers, for the sake of the ordinary people. Now, at this point of the story, the narrative does the splits, because two of the villagers sort of stay on the case of recruiting the samurai, now with Kambei's taking the lead on that. And two of the others return to the village. And I haven't mentioned Mosuke, who's sort of a very minor figure in the film, played by Yoshio Kosugi. Now, why does Kurosawa do that? Why does the film sort of split into these sort of two narrative paths at this point? Why does it bifurcate in that way, apart from being in the service of a certain narrative economy, of sort of moving everything along very well at the same time? It's also eloquent because what we're going to get in the course of the film is more and more a sense of the sort of the secret life of the villagers, of things that they keep secret from the samurai, which turns out to be quite a lot, and also the life of the village that they want to keep hidden from the samurai, and it particularly relates to the women in the village and the daughters in the families. They're afraid of the samurai will be these sort of pillaging rapists, and they need to hide a lot from them. Let's talk a little bit about this figure right now, the figure of Yohei, played by Bokuzen Hidari. Yohei has one expression on his face virtually for the entire film. It's an expression of fear, and indeed, his face is like one of those classic dramatic masks that cover the entire face and that bear a fixed expression. So Yohei it's as if his face is a mask with the continuous sort of downturned mouth of fear. And the actor, of course, does it superbly, and it must have been really one incredible discipline to pretty much hold this face, this afraid expression for virtually the entire film. And that tells you something important about Kurosawa's direction of actors. Of course, it varies from actor to actor what their range is, like what range they are allowed in their expressions, particular use of their body, particular use of their face, and so on. I mean, Kanbei, as played by Shimura, has a much more naturalistic range of many expressions, whereas Yohei is fixed as a more minor character in this whole system of the film. He can be sort of fixed by that one trait, that one tick, as it were, that one identifying mark. Now, Kurosawa was never afraid to kind of use characters as caricatures of themselves, to sort of draw them in this very economical way, to give them an identifying mark. In the case of Kanbei himself, he's given a very important characterising gesture, which is the gesture of him moving his hand across his head. Of course, after that first scene, we see him it's his bald head. And if you look very carefully, very closely in the film, you'll see there must have been so much care and attention to this that, his hair is just slightly growing back, as it were, day after day of the plot. And, it's fantastic, the level of the detail and of the observation of detail in this film. And so his gesture is sort of running his hand across his head, as it were, feeling how bald he is or how much hair he's got, and that has a whole range of emotional meanings in the film. Sometimes it just means he's a little bit shy or embarrassed, or he doesn't want to speak. Sometimes it means he's thinking, he's reflecting. It has all sorts of eloquence across the film. Eloquence is important in Kurosawa. It's when I talk about things being expressive or being meaningful, it's not so much to do with the symbolic meaning of an object or a gesture or an event or a situation. It has more to do with what I'm referring to as eloquence, as how fitting for this moment of the film, for this situation. How fitting is this particular expressive gesture. That's another key to Kurosawa's great art. Okay, here we're in another variation on the test. And this particular character, which is Gorobe, played by Yoshio Inaba, he's a different kind of samurai. Now, it's like all of the seven samurai kind of add up, in a sense. Their different traits add up to the one ideal samurai. And whereas Kanbei stands for wisdom, for selflessness, and so on, Gorobe is this very wise guy I mean, wise in that he has wisdom, not that he's a smart aleck. And he joins through this immediate admiration for Kambei. And he talks about how, the great friendships can begin with an encounter, with a random encounter. And he's one of several of the samurai, others we've yet to meet, who stands for sort of the virtue of remaining sort of placid and good-natured. That's an important level of affect, as it were, of emotional behaviour in this film, and in the composite of the ideal samurai. Now, saying a little bit more, and I'll be doing this throughout the commentary, saying a little bit more about Kurosawa's style, that is to say, everything to do with the form, the formal organisation of the film and its sound and image. One of the most important keys to Kurosawa is, we could say, musicality. And I don't simply mean the particular score written by Fumio Hayasaka, quite famous score with its 2-3 different themes, particularly the wonderful theme associated with the character of Kikucho. Now, I'm not talking about the score as such. I'm talking about the entire film, considered as having the structure of a musical piece, of the highs and lows, fast and slow, and of course different musical moods and the transition between different moods. Now, this was a central thing on Kurosawa's mind already in the scripting of the film, because very early on, when he and Hashimoto were grappling with the basic story and the basic structure of the film, Kurosawa said to Hashimoto that he wanted Hashimoto, to keep in mind at all times Antonin Dvořák's New World Symphony. And Hashimoto, fortunately, completely understood this reference instantly and began to vibe with Kurosawa. Yes, that we need this kind of mood for the start of the film, and then things get more frantic and energetic in this part of the film, and then we need a lull, a rest here. And they were sort of following the different parts of the New World Symphony. That was their sort of reference in their mind. Now, that didn't mean that finally Kurosawa was, going to get the rights to using Dvořák on the soundtrack. Nothing as obvious as that. That's something more you would hear in other filmmakers or in contemporary filmmaking. That if you think of Beethoven, you stick Beethoven on the soundtrack. It's more the Stanley Kubrick method. No, but for Kurosawa, it's important to have a sort of a background formal style reference in terms of the flow, the emotional flow, the mood flow of the piece, and to have that, more or less sort of clearly worked out as a background reference, as that shape of the film would be the one that they would follow through on. So this musicality of Kurosawa is, of course, what puts Kurosawa above many other filmmakers, in that it becomes part of every decision, every formal decision, every stylistic decision. The editing, the shots, the transitions, the famous wipes, the hard edge wipes, as they're called, where one image replaces another on screen. And so for Kurosawa is someone who he liked to edit as he shot. He would shoot material and then, would often be editing at night, a sort of a rough assembly of the material. As he said, it was so he knew what was missing, what still needed to be done. So in many ways, at the writing level and then in the filming level, much of the editing had already been foreseen because of this importance of the musical structure. Okay, let's stop on that point and go to this scene. Another classic anthology scene of Seven Samurai, where we meet the character of Heihachi, played by Minoru Shiaki, and the famous thing of the wood chopping, the gag of the wood chopping, which is that, you know, when he hears what it's all about and how many brigands, how many bandits they need to fight and kill, he loses his cool and does not perfectly chop the wood. Now, this scene is so great because it builds up to that gag. There it is right there. Kurosawa was never afraid of a good gag, a good physical gag. You can see that from, you know, his first feature film, Judo Saga, in 1943. Doubtless a debt there to comedy, to silent comedy of various countries, including America, of course. And it's also an index of character, of Heihachi's character, that he's another of the samurai who is essentially good-natured. It's said later that he helps cheer everyone up. He's not like the most sort of skilled, sort of physically skilled and perfect samurai, but he has another kind of function within the group. When it comes to the perfect skilled samurai, that's who we are meeting now. Kyuzo, played by Seiji Miyaguchi. Now, this guy, Kyuzo, is incredible in the film. He is the most sort of held in, the most severely restrained, the least seemingly emotional, at least in terms of emotional display. He displays less of his emotion than any other of the samurai. This scene, of course, completely different in its tone to what we've just witnessed with Heihachi. So this is part of this musical contrast going on here between the moods of scenes. Now, these shots of the onlookers, we'll come back to the role of onlookers in the film. But it's so fantastic because if you look at those onlookers all together, you'll see three variations. You'll see three different sort of speeds and rates of turning one's eyes. The local villagers, sort of their eyes are darting all over the place. Katsushiro is moving his eyes quite a lot from, you know, one fighter to the other. But Kanbei hardly ever shifts his eyes. He shifts his eyes very particularly because he knows what to look at. He knows what to look for. And the others don't. They're just sort of watching a fight and hoping they're going to catch the key moment. But Kanbei knows, and he also knows, as he comments, how it's all going to end. It's just going to end badly for this fool who is challenging Kyuzo. So here we have this extraordinary display of this sort of steely, sort of perfectly refined swordsman's skill of samurai in the body and in the gestures and in the intense concentration of Kyuzo. And what we're going to get now is the second great moment of slow motion in the film. Also observe here in how this is shot that Kurosawa was always going from, you know, one side, then right around to the other side of the fighters. So here's the fantastic, once again, this play on stillness and motion. And this moment where we think, is this a freeze frame? Like, there's absolutely nothing moving in the shot for a split second until the body topples in slow motion. And of course, you know, many directors, Sam Peckinpah at the helm of people who took a lot from Kurosawa. and of course took a taste for slow motion. But of course it's important to realise how sparing Kurosawa is in this film with slow motion. I mean, it's like a film full of slow motion, right? It's just those two moments when we get to the final battle. No slow motion there. Kurosawa makes a clear difference between scenes in which slow motion can be eloquent, when it can be truly expressive, and then other sorts of battle scenes where it won't help, it won't enhance anything. In the final battle, we need to be right in the middle of the mud and the chaos and the frantic movement. Slow motion would just be a confusing element in that kind of battle scene. So we can see that Kurosawa is always making these decisions, these fine distinctions between different kinds of scenes, different needs of each situation, different needs of each dramatic or comical scene. Let me comment here on how much of the film is set within, quite claustrophobic interiors. And indeed, he will sometimes put sort of action scenes or quasi-action scenes inside these very cramped spaces. This is something that Kurosawa was attracted to throughout his career, and some of his films have very long sequences, like across many scenes, set within a single interior space. This was a challenge that he loved to deal with, like how to bring alive an interior, how to show it in different aspects, how many different kinds of setups could he get going with the camera in that space, what kind of movements were possible. Of course, these interiors are sets. The entire film is an incredible patchwork of, bits of real landscapes in different spots and interior studio sets, really seamlessly knitted together. I mean, this film has an incredibly strong illusion. It gives you the incredibly strong illusion of having been filmed in a real place with a real geography. But of course, all of the geography is invented, or it's sort of patched together through the logic of the film, of its writing, of its staging, and of its editing. And the film is really a marvel of craft at that level. Now we're having here the prolonged agony of young Katsushiro, who at this point is told, "You're not part of the group. You're too young, you haven't done enough, you don't deserve it, but you'll have stories to tell of, hanging out with this group of samurai." And we get this discussion about it. Perhaps we should treat him as an adult. Let's take him. This is typical of the film, that a decision is made and then a discussion takes place. And here, of course, Kanbei touches his head, because even though we're seeing him from the back in this shot, we're very aware that, well, he's thinking about it, he's reflecting. Another reason to have Kanbei from the back there is that he doesn't realise that Kyuzo has just entered, and he has reconsidered. So at this point, as it were, they have six definite samurai, and of course he's the sixth who's been accepted now, to his great joy. Now, notice that detail. As Katsushiro sort of hurries past in his joy, he slightly disturbs the peace of mind of Kyuzo. Now, once again, there's no real reason for that in the scene. It's not part of the actual narrative dynamics of the scene at this point. But it's very important that Kurosawa wants to put in our mind a link, to make an association between Kyuzo and Katsushiro. because that is going to become part of the plot. It's often said of Kurosawa, very correctly, that he was obsessed with what's called foreshadowing, or we could also call it flagging. In other words, if something is going to happen later, if something is going to be important later, just provide a tiny little preview of it, even if it's just in the detail of an image or a passing gesture. And we've seen that with the initial introduction of Kikuchiyo and Katsushiro, and we've seen it with this now, with this link happening between Kyuzo and Katsushiro. Time for another variation on sort of the running gag of the test, as it were, the front door test of the samurai, which Kikuchiyo dismally fails. He's drunk. Kanbei says no samurai gets that drunk, that they sort of are not in control of their wits and of the sensory input of a situation. Well, Kikuchiyo is definitely out of control of his wits here. This leads to one of these moments I'm talking about, where Kurosawa uses this as an opportunity to kind of explore a closed claustrophobic space. This is sort of a abortive attempt at a chase, at a pursuit, at a fight, which doesn't really happen. But for a few moments there, Kikuchiyo is sort of lurching forward, and the camera can get some movement happening. It can frame Kikuchiyo behind the bars of wood there. It's all a way of adding visual interest. You know, the qualities of visual surprise, of visual variation, of visual invention, incredibly paramount in Kurosawa's aesthetic. Well, Kikuchiyo, what kind of character is he? Well, it's completely evident. He's a completely excessive character. The legend has it that Kurosawa really gave Mifune a lot of freedom in this part to just go all the way with physical gesture, to at times behave like an animal and do animal gestures, to do drunken gestures, to do completely discombobulated, uncoordinated gestures. This wonderful moment here where he's looking for the scroll, supposedly of his birth, and he's standing as a samurai, and he can't even find it, you know, inside his very minimal costume there, which is more revealing than it is concealing of his body. You know, he has to search all around. He has to turn away from the camera, as it were, and search through his person for this document. Another part of the legend of Mifune's role in this film, is certainly Mifune's own version of it, is that he says that at a certain point of working up the film, Kurosawa and the writers sort of had 6 samurai who were all rather serious, and that Kurosawa realised, according to Mifune, that they needed a kind of a buffoon figure, a joker figure, a trickster figure, who would be the complete opposite of the other samurai, who would provide laughter, but also provide a certain sort of commentary, often very mocking commentary, on the samurai and on the villagers. And indeed, there will be many important scenes constructed around that. Oh, what a fantastic moment that was, that we just saw, so carefully prepared, that Kyuzo, who's ever sort of watching and ever aware and ever concentrated, is totally ready to grab the sword of Kikuchiyo so that he doesn't stick it into Katsushiro here. And here's the sort of the ultimate point of this kind of literal breaking open of the closed set through this renewed chase, fight, action. It's fantastic. I mean, Kikuchiyo in the film is a totally explosive character. Explodes in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of situations. And really, you can study Mifune's performance forever in this film. We'll come back to a particular scene later, which is one of his great scenes, a monologue that he gives, but of course always completely physical. It hardly needs to be pointed out that one of the major things in Kurosawa's cinema is to find physical gestures and situations that are expressive of inner character. It's not enough for characters simply to speak to reveal themselves. Kurosawa always said that what he disliked in cinema was exposition and explanation. If a character needs to explain what he is and what the situation is that he or she is in, this is bad. You've got to show it. You've got to show it through the body. You've got to show it through the interaction of bodies, the interaction of bodies in spaces, whether they are more cramped or closed or whether they're open spaces. So this is totally the focus of Kurosawa's mise-en-scène. And once again, you can study this film forever for its extraordinary amount of variation on that principle. It's the thing that really guided Kurosawa through the making of all of his films, basically, from the first one right through. Now, it seems like we might have reached a certain plateau in the formation of the group. Now the film's going to do something very different. We go to this scene of a woman seen from the back with particular emphasis on the shape of her behind. We're wondering what's going on here. And then a man behind this woman. Of course, this is, he's the father, that's Manzo, the father, and this is his daughter, Shino, played by Keiko Tsushima. Why this sudden eruption of femininity into the film? Well, it's already been announced that the villagers are very scared of the samurai taking the young women on the village. Now, I call it an eruption of femininity in the film. Of course, we've already seen women in the early scenes of the film. We've seen quite a few elderly women. And later we'll see a whole lot of younger women, as it were, come out of hiding. Because hiding is really what's at issue here. In terms of this particular case, Manzo wants to cut the hair. He's going to cut the hair of his daughter. Look at this shot. It's a pan shot, essentially. So much is going on in it, right? So much movement in several directions, sort of near the camera, further away from the camera, and then a cut on movement. It's one of those sort of cell-like moments where you see the way that Kurosawa's style, his integration of camera movement, actors' movements, and editing, how that all works together. So, Manzo wants to disguise his daughter as a boy. And this will lead to a sort of a light, slight comedy of gender confusion and jokes about gender confusion in the film. Finally, no one is fooled for very long that Shino is really a girl. And of course, it is from this this story of Shino, who will be really the central female character that we see in the film. It's from that a certain romance, certain difficult and finally sort of tortured and impossible romance will spring forth. This relates to something that right from the mid-50s, critics were saying about Kurosawa, is that there's sort of two sides to his sensibility. On the one side, there's like a romantic, lyrical side, which doesn't always express itself in stories of romance between men and women, although that can be part of it. But there's, in a more general sense, a sort of a romantic, lyrical side, and then there's action-based side. And the action-based side tends to be very much male very much masculine in its orientation. We'll come back to this very interesting point of Kurosawa's cinema as, in some senses, essentially a masculine cinema. And that's why I spoke of this scene of Shino as a sort of an eruption of femininity. And we'll see a couple of eruptions of what a woman is and what a woman signifies within the world of this film, because they really are like these particular explosive moments in the system of the film. Okay, let's get back to Kikuchio here, who has not stopped following the samurai. He's back to his on-the-road following, not only of Kanbei now, but of the large six-person troupe. This particular moment here, which is a delightful moment of Kikuchio in the water, where once again we have a whole celebration of his physicality and of his body, and his stripping off to get into the water. It relates to a specific detail in Kurosawa's autobiography that he wrote, something like an autobiography it's called, which Kurosawa talks about catching fish with his bare hands. And this has led various commentators and critics to speculate on the question of, is there a sort of an alter ego of Kurosawa inside the film? And is it Kikuchio, for instance, or is it Kanbei? In fact, it seems to be, once again, this composite figure of the ideal samurai uniting, all seven of the samurai. That seems to be what Kurosawa sort of sees himself in or identifies in, if we want to go that way. I'll come back to this point of Kurosawa, as it were, inside his own work. Now, you've just seen a beautiful moment there. The sudden reappearance of Kikuchio in front of the samurai group rather than behind. Now, everything to do with appearance and disappearance. This is one of the main formal stylistic parameters in Kurosawa, and that has to do with people like exiting the frame, the film frame, and reappearing in it in all sorts of ways. It has to do with the situation, as we just saw then. Kikuchio off screen, as it were, getting into a new spot and then suddenly reappearing and pretending to lead the samurai onwards in the right direction. So everything to do with appearance and disappearance, visibility and invisibility. These were things, sort of aesthetic properties, I think, that obsessed Kurosawa. And of course, it was another way to bring dynamism and surprise and variety to scenes. That, more than anything, was what he was into. Now, here's another superb scene showing off the excessive character of Kikuchio. Notice that when he laughs, his whole upper body moves. His shoulders move up. We're seeing this right now. It's fantastic how human gestures are exaggerated in Kurosawa. And we've seen it in Yohei, his face of fear. That's one kind of exaggeration. And in the case of Kikuchio, we have exaggeration in motion, in these endlessly mobile gestures that he produces. This scene, of course, is devoted to the matter of the villagers' fear. They're so scared of the samurai that they're not there to greet them. This is rather disconcerting to the samurai. And there's it's the beginning of very difficult social relations between samurai and villagers, which Kikuchio, his wisdom, as it were, his innate animal wisdom, which is triggered by the fact that he does like a dog-like gesture there. Because of course he in fact, as it be revealed, was a villager's son. He's very close to the villagers' sensibility, their mindset. He understands it, he predicts it. It's a very important aspect of Kikucho, and one of the reasons that Kurosawa made him such a central figure in the film is that he is a mediating figure. He's between samurai and villagers in his social status, in his behaviour. He's never, as it were, fully samurai. Well, perhaps we could say that he becomes fully samurai by the end of the film. Even then, well, we'll see that there's a certain ambiguity to that. And on the other hand, he comes from the village class, but he also has a lot of contempt for the villagers, for their cowardice, for their scheming, for their, what turns out to be their subterfuge, their hidden ways and tactics. So here we have another side of Kanbei shown in this scene, where they go talk to Gisaku, the elder here. And another scene that shows you how brilliant Kurosawa is with these sort of enclosed and rather cramped spaces, which of course he is able to manipulate because it's a set and he can put the camera wherever he wants to reveal different aspects and to play with the different shot sizes, the scale of things in the frame. I mean, Kurosawa is a master of scale, as it were, sliding scale, shifting scale of things within the frames and from shot to shot. This constant movement from packs to individuals, which we've seen just in the last bunch of shots, from a close-up of Gisaku to this sudden, frantic group movement because of a sound, an off-screen sound. Very important in the film, the role of sound, which Kurosawa was very sensitive to, and off-screen sounds. So Hayachi was introduced as a woodchopper with the sound of the wood chopping. He's off-screen and then he appears on screen, but we've already heard him. You can connect that to the work in the 1950s and beyond of Robert Bresson, the French filmmaker. The sound always leads the eye, as it were. So that's another very important thing here. Who sounded this alarm, this percussive tapping? Well, of course, it was Kikucho, which gives him a chance to mock the villagers. But you've got to give it to Kikucho. He's actually managed to bring everyone into the same space at last through the imaginary, the pretend threat of the bandits, the brigands arising. Now we see in this scene, and many other scenes will build on it, is Kikucho and Mifune's skill at mimicry and mockery. Not only can he, act like an animal, he can also act like a child. He pulls any kind of face that he wants, face of a monster, of a ghoul, to sort of frighten people. And, as it were, totally connected to the earth, to the dirt and sand and whatever it is that surrounds him. He's constantly, kicking up the dust of the spot where he's in. I mean, just fantastic work that Mifune did on this. Now let's focus a little bit on this character in the foreground, Rikichi. Now he's been present, visible in quite a lot of the film so far. I've referred to him as the central villager that Kurosawa chooses to dramatise. And there is a mystery attached to this character which is slowly unveiled, which is the fact that Rikichi is alone. He doesn't have a wife. And in this scene, where Kikucho is making a joke about that, we see this rage explode in Rikichi. And so there are hints at a trauma here, which will become explicit later, which is that his wife was taken by the bandits, and indeed she will appear in the film at a very crucial and dramatic moment. But it's part of Rikichi's sort of character situation that he doesn't want to speak about this trauma. He doesn't want to let on about it. Whereas some of the samurai stand for, as it were, the positive power of restraint, or even of repression, of containment, perhaps would better to say, containment of emotion. With Rikichi as a villager, this repression of emotion is seen to be unhealthy, and eventually, one of the samurai will try to have a good chat with him about the need to talk, to get it out, to share the problems with another person. So once again, we see a very careful comparison between, as it were, the same thing, emotional reserve, but how it works differently in different characters, in different social classes, as it were, and in different situations. Okay, we've reached this point around the 75-minute mark, where we're going to get a very elaborate sequence of mapping with reference to an actual, map that Kanbei has and that he's drawn, and there will be a lot of reference to maps, to lists, to a flag, which has a very important role in the film. And these are, in a sense, not strictly necessary in any way for the plot, but they're very important for Kurosawa to make us understand the fictional geography of the film. That literally we know where north, south, east and west are in terms of this village. We know where the bridge is, we know where they're going to flood, we know where the harvesting takes place, we know where the hills are. Even though, as I said before, all of this is, of course, very cleverly put together of a patchwork of places and sets and so on. But within the illusion of the fiction, it has to be mapped very precisely so that we have some sense of, even how long it would take to get from, one point of the village to another. Because at a certain point, when the action starts, Kanbei will be yelling instructions like, go east, go south. So it's important that we have an orientation. This is very different to a lot of contemporary action cinema, of course, where it's often said that, people refer to chaos cinema, chaotic cinema of contemporary action films of the 21st century, say, although it starts before then, where, you're just sort of lost in the middle of a blitz of action. And sometimes it's only a filmmaker like Michael Mann, who obviously knows his Kurosawa films very well, Michael Mann or John Frankenheimer in the film significantly titled Ronin, which is not a historical film about samurai. It's, it's about, contemporary crooks, mastermind crooks. But in films by Mann, by Frankenheimer and by some others, this lesson of mapping, of showing the precise planning of a defence, as it is in this case, or of an attack, or of a heist, like in a heist in Steven Soderbergh film, to give the spectator this kind of orientation is important for the effectiveness of the action. Chaos cinema, as it's called, has its own sort of immersive effectiveness. But Kurosawa comes from another tradition, really. He's at the head of another tradition, which has to do with orienting the spectator and giving them, as it were, a place within the physical world from which they can comprehend the flow of the action. Now, speaking of giving the spectator, as it were, a place within the fiction, there's another very important thing that Kurosawa does, again quite obsessively, which is that you will have noted in the film up to now and right through the film, there's an enormous emphasis on crowds of onlookers, packs of people who are looking, sometimes furtively looking out through windows. We see this later in the film, or from ditches. Crowds that follow Kanbei in his introductory scene, where he's disguised as the monk and rescues the child and kills that guy who took the child. There's always a crowd, and the crowd sort of moves forward and is always trying to get the best spectating position, craning to see the action. Now, why is this? Well, firstly, it has like an enormous sort of visual appeal for Kurosawa. And we're seeing that here, for instance. We not only have the line of villages that Kikuchiyo is hoping to train to whip into shape, we also have, of course, the crowd of the children. This is important in many ways. It brings out this childlike quality in Kikuchiyo, which is not something we've observed specifically up till now. And, of course, the fact that he plays to children, as he's doing here, with this wonderful exaggerated mimicry, this caricature of fear and so on, which the children love, and he plays up to the children as his audience. So coming back to this idea of an audience, having an audience within the film to observe the action. Why do that? Here I draw on an idea from the Australian film critic and filmmaker Philip Brophy. And he once wrote an article back in the 1980s about a process that he called the bonding of audience and product, like product meaning, for instance, a film. And what he talks about in that article is how one way to sort of secure a real audience's involvement, the real spectator's involvement, is to sort of double them or mirror them inside the film. In other words, the audience watching the film is mirrored by an audience inside the film. And this is audience-product bonding. It's a certain kind of thing that we see a lot in, for instance, in films about music, in Purple Rain by Prince, or in any number of music-based films or musicals. There is the presence of an audience, which in a way, the reactions of that audience inside the film can sometimes be a sort of an almost ecstatic way of calling forth the same response from us, the real audience, whether it's admiration or joy or whatever it may be. Now, I think Kurosawa, outside of, the tradition of the musical and of the music-based, musical performance film, it seems that he truly believed in this principle, because there is so much emphasis on contriving audience groups inside the fiction of Seven Samurai and in some of his other films as well. And with this one, remember that Kurosawa's aim was to make this sort of absolutely rich entertainment film. He went for commercial success, and he got commercial success from this movie above, almost any other of his movies. And so I think he had a very intuitive sense of the power, sometimes the almost manipulative power of this audience bonding, audience product bonding technique. Okay, now this is one of these wonderful sudden changes in mood and in atmosphere and in imagery that we get in Kurosawa, part of the sort of sudden musical changes, as it were, the musicality changes. So we have young Katsushiro in a field of chrysanthemums. If you look very closely earlier in the film, this is also foreshadowed. This is also flagged that there's just like a little, patch of chrysanthemums somewhere earlier in the film to set up this, beautiful kind of lyrical explosion here. So here is the lyrical and romantic side of Kurosawa. That we have Katsushiro and his encounter with Shino. Of course, he doesn't realise straight away that Shino is a woman. And so this is one of these sort of playful scenes about gender interaction. There'll be a pursuit, another one of these marvellous pan shots in Kurosawa. The cinematographer, by the way, is Asakazu Nakai. Obviously worked very closely and very well with Kurosawa. So here we get to a physical struggle, which Katsushiro presumes is man to man, until he realises that it's man to woman. And of course this opens up the possibility of a sexual relationship. Now, it's very important to note here that Katsushiro is not at all a macho in the film, insofar as, you know, there's really no sort of macho in the samurai, as in, you know, an assertive sexual display, because the life of the samurai, for most of the samurai, seems to be completely sexless. As I mentioned before, this reserve, this repression of certain instincts, of certain drives, is what helps to form the character of the samurai, certainly the ideal samurai. Of course, the fallen samurai on the side of the bandits are the raping and pillaging sort. But for young Katsushiro, who is yet to mature in his samurai ways, he is still open to the possibility of sexual drives, and the film will follow this up later. Now, here's another classic scene in the film. Another key scene for Kikuchiyo. He has discovered the treachery, in a sense, all of this hiding, this deceit of the villagers, who have stored all this samurai gear because they themselves have killed samurai, presumably wandering samurai, you know, wandering around the countryside, not people who they hired to protect. And they've hidden this armour, they've hidden weapons, they've hidden food. So this is an uncomfortable revelation for the samurai group, which, you know, tellingly, only the mediating figure, Kikuchiyo, sort of could have found out. Now, there's a superb article written in 2019 in the French magazine Cahiers du Cinéma. It's a scene analysis of this scene by Sophie Charland. And her article does a sort of shot-by-shot account of this scene. And she brings out all of the incredible flow, once again, the very musical flow of moments of stasis here in Kikuchiyo, and then his explosion into action. Notice the particular dialectic, we could call it, of you know, sitting down or lying down and standing up, which is a constant thing in the film and in Kurosawa generally. You know, springing up, you know, falling down, you know, crouching down, but very quickly, very suddenly. These sudden movements. Now, this is a scene where we get this total expression of the rage, the sort of almost nihilistic rage of Kikuchiyo. And in a sense, his distance from both the villagers and the samurai. He gets to give this in-between, this mediating speech, not to bring the groups together, but in a sense to insist on their difference, to insist on all of the dark sides, the dark shades of this relation between samurai and villagers. It's very important to hear that the samurai themselves become an audience in this scene. They become the spectators who can only, watch and listen. Whereas Kikuchio, as it were, takes the floor and delivers this speech. He does this marvellous gesture in the scene where he sort of hurls the arrows, and as Sophie Chaland points out, the arrows actually stick, to the wall. Here is this gesture right now, and she refers to that as as an eloquent way of saying that this is a speech with a lot of good points in it. It's a very pointed speech that hits its mark. That's once again the eloquence of the physical gesture, the unreal eloquence of the fact that all those arrows would stick in the wall so perfectly. And once again the incredible dynamism of Mifune in this scene. Not only his sort of falling and rising, and his final sort of collapse into tears, but also everything that the armour, which he's sort of, in a sense, mockingly dressed himself in samurai armour. All of the movement of the armour, the helmet around his face. Now, this leads to an unexpected response, particularly from Kanbei. There are tears in Kanbei's eyes, who has realised you're a farmer's son. There's a further revelation to come later in the film about Kikuchio, but for the moment, the revelation process comes to this: you're a farmer's son. And as I say, the tears in Kanbei's eyes are one of these moments in the film where we can broadly say that, the characters in this film are types, stereotypes of different sorts and at different levels, and at different levels of being, as it were, fleshed out or characterised. But there are moments in the film where the character exceeds the type, where there's something that they do, something that they say, some reaction that comes from them, which we didn't expect. And the tears of Kanbei is one of those moments in the film. It's not a reaction that we expected, and there are a series of those moments across the film. Now, it's important in the film that across its expansive running time, it gives Kurosawa and his writers a chance to set up different permutations, like different one-to-one links or exchanges or comparisons between one samurai and another. And so in this scene, Katsushiro and Kikuchio sort of have a moment of reflection. A whole number of the samurai are sort of, as it were, reflected through Katsushiro, who's constantly looking up to one or another, admiring one or another, trying to work out one or another of them. And in some ways, he is another figure of identification, or a sort of vector of identification for the spectator, for us, trying to work out, trying to comprehend and understand the psychology of the samurai and the group psychology of the samurai as a collective in this film. Now, in this section of the film, before we get to intermission in a little while, this is a section that has a lot to do with the training of the community of villagers. And this brings us back to the point of in what ways and how deeply and how importantly or not the film can be seen as some kind of reflection or dialogue with its times, the times of mid-50s Japan. And essentially, I would have to say there is no agreement between the various commentators, scholars and critics on this. For instance, if we take the filmmaker and writer Noel Birch, who I discussed a lot in my commentary for Ikiru, I won't be discussing him so much here because, in fact, he doesn't hold this film Seven Samurai very highly in Kurosawa's career. He really devotes nothing to it, and not even one sentence in a long essay he wrote in the early 70s. And then in his in his book on Japanese cinema, To the Distant Observer, he really only gives it a footnote in which he concedes that it's the finest of Kurosawa's minor jidaigeki. Jidaigeki being a historical story, historical film, as opposed to the gendaigeki, which are modern contemporary set films. Now, Birch, his one comment about Seven Samurai and about a certain tendency in Kurosawa in the mid-50s onwards, he says that it follows the reformist ideology dominant in that period in Japanese history, which is the typically petty bourgeois doctrine of the heroic individual as agent of social change. So that's one way of trying to see Kurosawa's films within their social context, and even as, in a sense, as some kind of propaganda for social reformism in Japan, sort of giving, as it were, the ideology through entertainment of how to shape society and so on. On the other hand, of course, one thing that's very important in Seven Samurai is precisely the training of the community, the bringing together of the community. And of course, yes, Birch is right in that they are brought together by these heroic figures of the samurai. But it's the community itself bonding, which is very important, and in fact is triumphant by the end of the film, in the very final scene of the film. That too has its underside in Joan Mellon's excellent book on Seven Samurai in the British Film Institute Classics series of books. What her idea is that one thing that Kurosawa reflects upon in this film is the sort of the rising up of a merchant class, as represented by the farmers, the villagers in this film, and then in fact their deceit, their manipulative ways is a sort of a dark sign of this ascent of a merchant class in what was the increasingly sort of capitalistic world of modern Japan in the 1950s. It's a reference to that, or it's a reflection of that. So we have some quite different viewpoints here, and then for another position again, we have Donald Ritchie, who basically argues in his terrific work on Kurosawa. Of course, he knew Kurosawa personally. He says that Kurosawa was not a person who was into ideology or into propaganda at all. He had his own story to tell, and that he did variations on that story across time. But that one can't really tie the evolution of Kurosawa's films or even any particular films to social movements, to movements within society and developments in the social framework. Ritchie somewhat puts Kurosawa outside of the cut and thrust of history in that sense. And I have some sympathy for Ritchie's position, because Kurosawa really did sort of hold to his particular kind of vision of individual and collective and so on. He really did hold on to that throughout his entire career, with some important shifts that we'll get to in a little while. Now, I've already spoken of the role, the relatively minor role in some sense of women in this film. Here's another important female figure, of course, the very old woman. And one of the things that is important here has to do with the sort of the resistance of certain villagers to the plan of Kambei. Certain villagers don't want to move from their homes, whereas the big lesson that Kambei tries to teach the community is that there must be sacrifice. This is what he calls the rule of war, that there must be a collective pulling together, there must be a collective defence, and that if individuals want to fight for themselves, they're going to lose. Right? Individual defence will always lose. And that's an important thrust of the samurai lesson, in a sense, in this film. Now, here we've seen this another one of these one-to-one samurai exchanges in the film, which is very important, between Katsushiro and Kyuzo. And Katsushiro knows, he's seen, that the older man has witnessed the relationship, the burgeoning relationship between himself and Shino. But it's very important, right, that he asks the older man, you know, are you going to tell? And Kyuzo responds, oh, do you want me to? Meaning that he won't, right? That he will hold those, as it were, merely personal stories of merely personal drives and whims and desires. It's better not to speak of them. It's better not to make them issues for the collective, for the samurai collective, for the group of samurai. It's better to keep them hidden. And that's both a testament to a certain kind of difference between two samurai, that exchange, and it's also further testament to the character of Kyuzo, who is so much into restraint. And we'll see a number of variations on this theme. Joan Mellon, who I've mentioned, makes the intriguing observation that Kyuzo, you know, practicing his swordplay in the rain is kind of a version of a cold shower. You know, it's like in Scorsese's Raging Bull, the way Jake LaMotta has to use, you know, ice cubes to quell his own erections, his own desire. Because he has to hold in all of the strength and energy for the fight in the ring, right? And there's some similarity that Mellon sees in Kyuzo's actions, and that kind of absolute sort of repression of the sexual drive. Well, right now we see another one of these surprising moments in the film, which is Kanbei with a child in his arms. Really a lovely and surprising thing. Very tender in the film. We see very few sort of tender gestures of the samurai in that way. We see many sort of more noble gestures, and we see the friendship between men as expressed in the samurai code and in the interactions between those specific samurai. But we get very little of that, for instance, relation to children. Now, we've seen that Kikuchio has a special bond with children, a special contact with them through his own childlike side. But it's very rare indeed to see this moment of tenderness such as Kanbei showed there. So that's another example of the idea that Jean-Claude Carrière talks about in his book about filmmaking, The Secret Language of Film, where he talks about the importance of having a moment where a character, no matter how stereotyped they are, you need a moment where a character goes to the end of themselves, where they do something unexpected. And Kurosawa, I think, was very alive to that idea. So now we're seeing another one of these fantastic scenes about the whole interrelation of a group, of a collective, and then a band of individuals who try to break from the group. And Kanbei's reaction here is not at all tender. It's, you know, take out your sword and scare the heck out of them. Literally scare them back into the group. And it's here that Kanbei gives his speech about the rule of war. It's typical of Kurosawa that he totally dramatises this in terms of, you know, the movement of bodies, the movement of groups. And in this camera, tracking, panning camera that will sort of follow the breakaway group and then follow their reintegration under duress here, will follow their reintegration back into the larger collective. And there's a return here, a humorous return here to Kikuchio's attempts to literally put the villagers in line. And in that, the figure of the ever-frightened Yohei is a recurring gag, in a sense, that he's never quite in line, or he's never quite in the place that he should be in the line, and Kikuchio has to sort of kick him back into that spot. And that the recurrence of that gag sort of gives colour to this scene that we're watching, so that it's not just sort of one long, impassioned, as it were, ideological speech by Kanbei, but that it's also redolent and reflective of the entire dynamic life of the film. Now, at this point, some viewers may be wondering, when does the action start exactly in this movie? We've had this very long period of what I've referred to as waiting or preparation or anticipation. And, we've still got a bit longer to go until the fighting breaks out. But for the moment, it's time for an intermission. And I'd like to take this opportunity to read to you from an article that I think gives a very good overview of some of the social context and the evolution of Kurosawa cinema. It's an article from 1966 by the Japanese critic Koiki Yamada, and it was I'm translating from the French version called Destiny of the Samurai, which appeared in Cahiers de Cinema magazine. So, referring to here Kurosawa's earliest work, it says, Kurosawa privileges the type of scenes that allow a young hero to exercise stoicism, a stoicism which is at once Cornelian, as in the French dramatist Pierre Corneille, and romantic. So it's Cornelian and romantic. The very story of Judo Saga in 1943 recalls that of Corneille's Le Cid. The hero finds himself obliged to struggle against the father of the woman that he loves. Yamada goes on to say that this film, early film Judo Saga, debut feature of Kurosawa, is simple, free and positive in its view of youth. It's his happiest film, where a certain naive symbolism really works and communicates to everyone a poetic emotion of a discreet lyricism. Then, in No Regrets for Our Youth, 1946, the first important post-war film by Kurosawa, one refines the director more on the side of Hugo, Victor Hugo. The struggle against society, its injustice, its incomprehension. The character of the figures in the film is stereotyped, the dramatic construction is schematic, and the political ideology is naive. The history of Japan between 1933 and 1945, the evolution from fascism to democracy, corresponds to the main character. But the extreme sincerity of the filmmaker renders the film very moving. This moral, sentimental chronicle of a young, modern Japanese person makes us already see the social vision of the filmmaker. The defeat of 1945 was an event for the filmmaker, as for everyone in Japan. He moves away from this reverie of youth, which was affirmed in Judo Saga, across a series of post-war films, No Regrets for Our Youth, Drunken Angel 1948, Stray Dog 49, up to Ikiru and Seven Samurai. One can follow his evolution toward apolitical liberalism, a romantic aesthetic, and a cinema of chivalry, as in knightly chivalry. The test that the filmmaker puts his heroes under is still a struggle against all the evils of society. Misery, poverty, the black market, scandal, injustices, egoism, and the bureaucratic mind, the yakuza, the world of crime. This idea of the defence and illustration of justice is affirmed in direct proportion to the romantic exaltation of the courage of the hero. This is a little like what Noel Birch was saying. But at the same time, because of his picaresque side, Kurosawa makes resonate the brutal cry of carnal man, of the angry dog, hurt by poverty and hunger, with no other aspiration than to get a substantial meal. And this character is indifferent to the melodramatic love that was in vogue in the films of the studio Sochiku at the time. Drunken Angel is an agonised, brutal, dynamic, strident film with its abrupt contours, its outrageous images and its disarticulated montage. This film sort of breaks the sweet aestheticism of Japanese cinema of the period, such as we see in Mizoguchi. Drunken Angel is in this sense the first Japanese film where violence seems almost apocalyptic, denouncing war, death penalty, poverty, social injustice, announcing a sort of cosmic and humanitarian palingenesis. I had to look up that word. It means reincarnation. So cosmic and humanitarian reincarnation. Through its desperate character, through the primitive cult of dynamism, the expressionism of Kurosawa seems to reinforce his tendency to a certain virile nihilism, which is announced in Drunken Angel. But deformed through romantic exaltation, naturalism will come quickly to a moralistic dogmatism. Kurosawa ends up formulating a humanism and converting to Confucianist Catholicism. The filmmaker abandons the trash heap of Drunken Angel to exalt the proud allure of the samurai. He takes refuge in a kind of sentimental idealism. And we must wait for a filmmaker like Imamura to return to the world of the trash heap. Okay, fascinating comments there from the mid-60s by the Japanese critic Koike Yamada. And we'll come back to some of those points later. It's very interesting, by the way, to see how different commentators sort of peg Kurosawa differently in terms of various sorts of spiritual and religious beliefs. There we have Yamada talking about Confucianist Catholicism, whereas, for instance, the critic Ghaffari, that I'll come back to, relates Kurosawa to the legacy of Zen Buddhism. Well, I'll come back to that. Now, here's a great scene. Here's another one of the sort of efflorescence of femininity in the film. Suddenly we see all these young women who've come out of hiding because they're part of the collective. They have to be integrated into the collective too. And it all has to do, of course, with harvesting. One of the major sort of plot devices that sets the timing of the story, as it were, is the harvest. You'll recall at the very start, the brigands were at the top of the hill, and basically it was like, well, shall we swoop down and, take what they've got and kill them all now? No, let's wait until the harvest. Well, of course, if they had have done that, if they had have swooped down and decimated the village, there would be no film, there would be no story. So, of course, there has to be a delay. Kristen Thompson has often said that, one of the most central things in narrative structure is delay. You've got to put something off in order to have a story exist, in order for it to stretch out and unfold. And that's exactly what happens in Seven Samurai. And that there's all this discussion of, they need to get the harvest happening. And, once the harvest has happened is when the attack will take place. So as I mentioned, we have this, as it were, explosion of femininity again, and this time it's Kikuchio who feels the stirring in his loins and converts that into a sort of a childlike glee, which goes nowhere in the film. It's not like Kikuchio follows up on his particular sexual desires, but it's another variation, of course, on the whole Katsushiro and Shino story. That we have once again this vision of women and of their place, their slightly disturbing place. I mean, disturbing for the characters and for their kind of society in the film. This led various critics and commentators, including Tony Raines, to speculate on this idea, very popular in 1970s and 1980s film theory and criticism, that women's sexuality is often registered as a kind of a problem, as a troublesome point in many films, in many classical films, and Seven Samurai can be used as an example of that. Although, as we'll see, it produces its own very particular variation on that by the end. Now, probably the strongest statement of this particular view of the film was expressed by the American critic Chris Fujiwara, a writer I greatly admire and respect. And in an article of 2002 called Cannon Fodder, What It Means to Call Seven Samurai a Great Film. And out of this brief but dense piece, I just want to pick out this bit for the moment. Chris Fujiwara says, Kurosawa's cinema is a male cinema, and maleness limits Seven Samurai. The feminine, when it surfaces, is excessive and scandalous. A girl viewed salaciously by the camera as she washes her hair, a face gleaming with lust in close-up. The extended time close shots of a kidnapped sex slave waking to find the harem on fire. Some of those are still later to come in the movie. Fujiwara goes on. As often in Kurosawa, female sexuality is disconcerting. Compare his portraits of mad and malevolent women in Throne of Blood, Redbeard and Ran. It seems less damning of the film that the farmers are portrayed as cowards and opportunists than that the women are shown as freaks. Now, that will strike some of us as a very strong claim, perhaps too strong, that the women are freaks in the film. But it does bring up a general important point of critique. I'm remembering the statements often made in public and in private by my friend Frida Freiberg, a great scholar of Japanese cinema and a wonderful film critic who recently died. And Frida always made the point that you have to understand the popularity of Kurosawa, particularly in the 1950s and into the 60s, as a real expression of a kind of boys' film culture, a very boyish film culture, where things like male bonding, sort of homosocial groups, virile heroism, whether it's in the films of Howard Hawks or John Ford or Kurosawa, that these were very highly prized by, a certain kind of male cinephile culture. I don't want to generalise too much about that. Of course, there are many women, including Frida, who really admired Kurosawa's skill as a filmmaker and his expressivity. But for Frida Freiberg, it was a question of, particularly, coming through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, that for her there was a downgrading of directors like Mikio Naruse, and Frida talks about Naruse on the British Film Institute release of Floating Clouds. There was a downgrading of directors who had more of an investment in the feminine, in female lives and problems and culture, and there was this valorisation of the virile adventure of Kurosawa and the fact that they were action films and so on and so forth. And I think this can be partly used to explain what I've referred to at the very beginning of this commentary as the slightly shifting position of Seven Samurai in the canon of world cinema. For instance, Seven Samurai is still pretty high up in the Sight and Sound canon poll of, a few years ago now, the latest iteration of that. Seven Samurai is in the top 20 films, whereas once it used to be in the top 10. And that is just one sign among many, one symptom among many of how Kurosawa may not be right now in the year 2024, may not be the sort of the most congenial filmmaker for the particular public discussions that are going on around the world about gender in cinema and so on and so forth. This is not to take away from his achievement at any level. Certainly I wouldn't want to take anything away from his achievement because of the particular obsessions we have in our own time and culture. But it is important to be aware that, some filmmakers kind of stick to their thing, and I think this is true of Kurosawa. He, as Donald Ritchie said, he sort of stuck to his vision, did variations on it, and it's the times that sort of change around him. And sometimes he's more in fashion and other times he's not. It's always interesting to see how this works. Well, back to the film and its details. We've just seen another wonderful gag sequence. It seems like something out of a silent comedy where Kikuchio's tried to master this old nag of a horse, and the horse is really getting out of his control. What's the point of this gag, apart from the fact that it's funny? It swaps, it reverses the relation of Kikuchio and the audience of onlookers that we've mentioned already, the function of onlooking crowds. Before, it was Kikuchio sort of making the crowd laugh at somebody else, such as Yohei. Now, it's the horse, as it were, making everybody laugh at Kikuchio. And of course, it's Kikuchio's own behaviour that's turning himself into an object of mockery and ridicule. We'll see even a further variation of that a little way on, when it even gets to the point where Kikuchio feels he has to apologise to the horse, that he's been too stern with it, too nasty, too abrupt, and that he needs to beg forgiveness from the horse. So you can see once again there Kurosawa's desire for variation, repetition, but variation of a situation, to sort of suddenly turn the tables, as it were, in this light-hearted manner on Kikuchio. Okay, we're back to what several of our quoted critics have referred to as the disturbance of women. And we're in another chrysanthemum field here, as it were, the site, the place of romance. And this very, very striking close-up here and camera move. There's really no other shot like this in the whole movie, which sort of goes around. It's almost like a Cassavetes shot or a Ingmar Bergman shot, with that sort of almost defacing, as in we don't see the whole face in the shot. And suddenly it's one of the few really expressionistic shots where in the middle of this light-filled field, we suddenly have this like shadows across the face, particularly her face. And so we have this moment where it seems that she's, offering herself to Katsushiro, and he's dead scared. And she kind of mocks him for this. You're not a real samurai. Presumably that means, you would take me if you were a real samurai, a true samurai. So that's an intense moment which, like some other moments in the film, is interrupted. The scene goes somewhere else entirely. The situation alters completely because of a sound that they hear. And so we sort of transit directly from the intensely interpersonal and sexual or erotic in that case, to the larger picture of the, as it were, slow arrival of the brigands. And this sort of a team of advanced team of scouts that has been sent from the brigands to scope out the village. So, of course, the brigands are unaware that the samurai have been hired. They have no idea that they're going to come against this particular defence force. This will also lead to some comedy in that Kanbei, of course, gives the command that they're all going to hide. The samurai are going to hide and not reveal their presence. But it's Kikuchio in his energetic yelping and running around that, of course, gives the game away. It's interesting in the two, as it were, green samurai, which is Katsuhiro and Kikuchio, that in both cases it's their inability to sort of hide their enthusiasms, which makes mistakes according to the samurai code, or it spoils the plan at any particular moment. Now, in terms of this idea of the characterization, the presentation of the samurai, and this idea that I've mentioned that, in a sense, the seven of them form a sort of a composite ideal samurai, it's worth quoting the words of the French critic Jacques Loussel, and this is from the recently republished volume 2 of his dictionary of films. And in his entry, which is very positive, on Seven Samurai, he says, without seeking to create three-dimensional characters, Kurosawa wanted, however, that his seven heroes be clearly differentiated, because each of them incarnate an aspect, a particular attitude inside the samurai morality and mindset. They represent a series of living variations on that. Kanbei incarnates samurai wisdom with a large measure of disenchantment, which doesn't stop him from acting, but it underlines the fleeting and self-destructive nature of his action. Heihachi and Korobe incarnate joviality, playfulness, good sense, good nature in this samurai morality. Kyuzo stands for ascetic concentration, which expresses itself in feats with weapons and his prodigious physical acts, accomplished with a sort of indifferent humility. That's very true in Kyuzo, this sort of quality of indifference, which we see a remarkable example of that later in the film. Loussel goes on. Katsushiro stands for youth, enthusiasm, generosity, the idealism of a beginning samurai. Shichiroji. Now, I actually haven't mentioned this samurai yet, played by Daisuke Kato. He is the character who comes in as Kanbei's old friend, and they had a dialogue much earlier in the film in which they recollect these days, the feudal days, when they belonged to a castle, but also the end, the passing away of that period, and what they now are, the wandering samurai. So Shichiroji, according to Loussel, stands for an effaced professionalism. So he's a modesty, and so he remains voluntarily in the shadow. And then Loussel goes on. Kikuchio, who has no name. Now, this is very important in the film, that the name of Kikuchio is, of course, the name that he had on the scroll that he'd stolen from somewhere. So it's not really his name, but a joke that sort of sticks to him is that, oh, well, let him have that name, since he stole it. That's what we'll call him from now on. So it's not his name. He is the most complex character, the most spectacular and the most innovative in the film. He is this person between two cultures, and the comparison between those cultures is the foundation of the film's meaning. He is a peasant by origin. He is a samurai by will. And he plays games. He is timid underneath his audacity. And above all, he's ill-suited in his own skin. He doesn't feel good in his own body. Kurosawa has portrayed this kind of picaresque character who is outside social class. He gives the character great truculence and a very artificial way of acting, more artificial than any other samurai. Being too many things at once, he is finally a character who appears as a kind of theatrical puppet that's totally fascinating, completely comic and pathetic. Pathetic in the sense of pathos. So that's a very interesting view of how we need to read, as it were, the samurai, to experience the samurai as this sort of composite and also sort of shifting body. And the shifts come from the 2x2 scenes where we get, the relation between two samurai and then two other samurai. And so they explore the various parts of this composite body. Okay, we've had a burst of action here. This is a very important moment in the film in terms of what Jacques Roussel was just pointing out, that in this relation, which is the central theme of the film, between the farmers and the samurai, there are moments where the farmers really do assert their own will, their own agency. And here, an incredible moment, this incredible shot with the very old woman appearing, and it's to her is granted the revenge. Let her avenge her son's death in her own way. And at this, of course, just in the shot you can see it, the samurai are in a sense completely helpless. It doesn't matter what their ideology of the collective is at this point. No, the farmers win there. They triumph at that moment. And that is going to be a foreshadowing of what happens at the very end of the film. I want to return at this relatively quiet moment of the film to detailing some of the aspects of Kurosawa's style and the integration of so much in the style. So with The Seven Samurai, we have the differentiation in character, but also, of course, in costume. They pretty much stick to the same costume for the entire film. In posture, right? Now, Kurosawa was a real master of physical posture and bearing. And so in this scene, for instance, Kikuchiyo sort of lying down is different to the others sitting. Different angles of sort of leaning forward, leaning back. I've mentioned the whole question of sitting and standing. We've just seen an example there of Kikuchiyo sort of suddenly emerging into the frame. And then quickly followed by the shot of Rikichi sort of coming into the frame, right? So there's this constant dynamism of body scale, of bodily movement, and this incredible attention to postures and to movement styles. Now, what's amazing in Seven Samurai is that this even relates to the animals, and particularly to the horses, right? So here, of course, we have this whole continuation of the gag of the horse that doesn't want to obey Kikuchiyo. I ask you to put your memory back 2 hours and 13 minutes or so to the start of the film, where we saw the brigands on top of the hill, and their horses were in incredibly agitated movement. They can hardly control their horses on top of that hill. Even that is significant, and it will become, in fact, part of the plot later in the film, in that these incredibly violent movements of, as it were, the enemy horses. The horse itself is a kind of weapon. under the hands of the brigands. Whereas, of course, our seven samurai, are not on horses for the duration of the film. So we have this difference between the enemy who's on the horse and the heroes who are not on the horse. Now, these things may seem like odd observations at times, but there is no kind of system of comparison or difference that Kurosawa has not thought through of this sort. He definitely thinks about things in terms of the difference between one kind of fighter and another kind of fighter. There's an extraordinary dialogue from the 90s, from 1993, between Kurosawa and Hayao Miyazaki, the great anime maker. And Miyazaki and Kurosawa have this, very friendly, sort of free-flowing dialogue. And it's really remarkable in that, almost 40 years after making this film, Seven Samurai, Kurosawa can completely remember the significance of certain physical and historical details, like a certain kind of weapon that is used by the characters in the film, a certain kind of costume, a certain kind of helmet, a certain kind of belt or headband or whatever it is. I mean, for him, all of the details were fully researched and then used, sort of woven into the structures of his film, the formal structures of his film. I'd like to pause at this scene. It's a scene that Chris Fujiwara, the critic, refers to as a Sternbergian scene, as in like a Joseph von Sternberg film. And he relates it to this imagery of women and women's sexuality in the film. So that we have these shots of these sort of limbs everywhere. It's kind of like a harem, it's like the sex den of the brigands. And there are just arms and legs sort of mostly naked everywhere in this very Baroque sort of space with, as it were, lace curtains and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it really is like a shot from a Joseph von Sternberg film. And Fujiwara refers to these sort of long-held shots right now of this woman who is aware that, that a fire has started, that they're all going to perish in a fire. Of course, what we're going to learn soon is, in fact, this is Rikichi's wife, and that she has been taken by the gang of villains and, has become sort of sex slave to them. And, of course, her and a whole lot of other women. So the women, managed to escape. Of course, we never see them again after this. They just sort of run out of the frame and they're gone. But of course, we have a particular dramatic emphasis on the interaction between Rikichi and his wife. And of course, she is so overcome by shame to be, as it were, discovered in this mode, that she runs back into the flame. And there was some real fire in this scene, according to Donald Ritchie, and some of the actors had some rather intense blisters from doing the scene. That's interesting because even at the level of the actors sort of giving themselves into the impulse of the moment relates to the content of the scene too, because one of the most important things about this scene is, within the fiction, is that Rikichi's passion, his impulse, is going to affect the fate of a samurai, Hayachi in this case. Now, there's something very important here in the death of Hayachi that I want you to take careful note of. So they have this struggle, and then there is a shot, a gunshot that rings out, and that effectively kills Hayachi. He takes a little while to die, but that's what kills him. Now, it's once again a very systematic and once again a very eloquent thing in the film that, in fact, most of the samurai who die are killed by gunshots, And we never see the firing of the gun that gives these murderous shots. We have no individualised villain. We don't get a close-up of that person cocking their rifle, whatever, and firing. We never know where the shots come from. We don't see them, right? So the gunshot, it's like death by sound, by a pure sound, that we only see its effect, its result. We actually don't see the cause, the act of firing a gun. And once again, this is completely systematic in the film. If Kurosawa does it once, he'll do it again, and he'll do sort of variations on this. There's even a particular moment in the film, a long shot, where Kikuchio is fired at from very far away. And I'm not sure if on a very large screen you can actually see somebody shooting at him. I think probably not. Maybe it's there. I'll check it one day. But at least on my small screen that I'm using right now, we do not see the shooter. And so that is part of the system of the film. And that speaks volumes about this coming new age, as it were. And this is something that fascinated Kurosawa, as he says to Miyazaki in this review, in this interview, dual conversation they have, which, by the way, is in the French magazine Apaches, a recent new French film magazine. And in that discussion with Miyazaki, Kurosawa shows himself to be quite fascinated by the history of weapons, of the technology of weaponry, and of course, which changed with the changing times. So a rifle, a gun, is a sign of a certain new modernity. It's the sign of course, not industrial modernity as we usually think of that, the meaning of that phrase, but within Japanese history, as it were, coming out of the end of this sort of 100 lawless years, this sort of century of lawlessness in Japanese history. There's these signs of things that are new, the merchant class, as Joan Mellon said, this new technology of weaponry. These are all signs of a future, and in some sense a rather sort of bleak future to come. And that's what some commentators on Kurosawa see this film expressing, that they claim that by this point in the 50s, Kurosawa was having an increasingly sort of pessimistic view of where Japanese society was going, sort of ever greater triumph of capitalism, American imperialism over Japanese culture, things of that nature, and that his films reflect that to some extent. Well, as I mentioned before, there are arguments about how reflective of historical reality, of contemporary historical reality, we can take Kurosawa's work to be. But definitely, he programmed into this film the changing technology of war. So the battle is on. Everything is heating up here, and the battle will, of course, proceed in various waves and across several days. I want to quote from a book. It's really the summary of a book published in 2013 on Seven Samurai. And it's a French book, published in Belgium, actually. And it's by Clélia Zernick. And I'll translate for you the summary of this book. Kurosawa's Seven Samurai is, above all, an action film, but behind questions of power and survival, there is, above all, an art of the mise-en-scène of bodies, suffering bodies, febrile bodies, humiliated bodies, but also bodies that educate, that train themselves and learn to articulate themselves with a group. Breaking the two-dimensionality of the cinematic screen, Kurosawa inscribes the tension of muscles, the surplus of flesh and physiology at the heart of the image. And he gives us to see the engenderment of a social body on the basis of the diversity of the various physical bodies. with a great economy of dialogue, the film constructs an allegory of a social institution and political institution by very subtly varying the inter-individual relations solely through the treatment of space and of bodies. The Seven Samurai is a choreographic film. Now, that is utterly true, everything that Zdeněk says there. And I'm also very drawn to that idea because it's very clear even from the very beginning credits, this idea of breaking the two-dimensionality of the screen, which leads to this idea of dynamism and of what many critics call the plastic beauty of the film, plastic as in the plastic arts of painting and so on. And we have this, very, very intense, very mobile plastic beauty of the film, which also is, as Zdeněk says, sort of in its way trying to sort of break to break through the screen, to break out of the screen and the two-dimensionality of the screen. And this is unquestionably part of the, really great emotional effect of Kurosawa's work. I want to take this a little bit further too. I mean, everyone with, an eye to see and an ear to hear can tell that Kurosawa is one hell of a filmmaker when it comes to this organisation of bodies and space and in the dynamic editing and in the constant movements in and out of the frame, these things that I've mentioned. But I think there's sort of one further step to take about this, which is precisely on the question of emotion. I'm very influenced here by a book that, in fact, hardly mentions Kurosawa at all. And it's Raymond Bellour's book of about 10 years ago now, called The Body of Cinema. And it's a book about, essentially, one of its main topics is emotion and how the spectator sort of feels emotion, how a film transmits emotion to a spectator. And it's an important part of what Bellour argues in this book, is that it's not solely through the story and the characters in a story, what they feel and suffer and experience and triumph and so on. It's to do with the style of the film, the form of the film, but in a more sort of complex and sometimes secret way than we realise, that it's something to do with the inner vibrations of a shot, the subtle movements of, whether it's the wind blowing the leaves on a tree, or it's the way a river flows. It's all of these rhythmic and, once again, musical properties of a shot and of a scene that, when cut together, they sort of communicate the vibration. They transmit emotion to us, sort of always, of course, involved with the story and the characters in Kurosawa's case, but in a sense even transcending the story and the characters. Now, I think this is incredibly true of Kurosawa, and I talk about it a little bit in my commentary for Ikiru, and I could do the same here with Seven Samurai, because sometimes it's the movement of the camera, or it's the movement of an object in the frame, not necessarily what you would expect to see at that moment. It's these kinds of decisions and stylistic choices that kind of pick up the vibration of an emotion, or that create in us the vibration of a feeling. And this, to me, is the real genius of Kurosawa, that through his intuition, through his craft, through his skill, through his sort of poetic feeling, he kind of always had a good sense of when to go to these unusual movements, these unusual shots, these unusual framings that may not seem in the first instance particularly motivated by whatever's happening in the scene. There's something exceptional about the way Kurosawa constructs the style of his work, and I think it has this directly emotional effect on the viewer, even when we're unaware of it, And so I think this is part of what Clelia Zernick calls the choreographic style of Kurosawa. I think it's part of what Kurosawa himself called the musicality of his films. That there's the telling of a story, and then there's this sort of stylistic elaboration of a story, but not in a purely classical way. Noel Birch, in his work on Kurosawa, he faults the writings of Donald Ritchie, Joseph Anderson, going back to the 1950s, who said things like, technique is a little bit too obvious sometimes in Kurosawa, but when it's good, it sort of serves to express the psychology or the feelings of the characters and their situation. And Noel Birch rightly says this is not good enough. It doesn't get you to the measure of Kurosawa's cinema, to use these very classical ideas that either technique, film style, has to be hidden, as in the sort of the classical illusion of film style, or that it should make very particular sort of expressive points. No, there's something more total about the form, about the style in Kurosawa. And that's the thing that really grips us. It grips us for, 3 hours, over 3 hours of this movie. Is this whole sense of the structure at every level. Now, on the matter of structure, let's go back to the writing of the film. And here I refer once again to Shinobu Hashimoto's book, Compound Cinematics, because he gives very, very interesting background on this project. He only talks about the writing. He never talks about the production because he didn't watch any of the shooting, and sometimes he didn't even watch the finished film. As Hashimoto says, there is nothing that obliges a scriptwriter to watch the finished film. And in the case of Kurosawa, I think he had such a clear idea of the movie from co-writing it that he sometimes didn't feel he needed to watch it. Okay, so in this book, he talks about the fact that Seven Samurai came from the ashes of two other projects. And this was after Rashomon, after Ikiru, on which Hashimoto had worked. And in both those cases, Hashimoto was the first writer, as in he did the first draft. And once there was a first draft, then it would go to the table work with Kurosawa and with Oguni, the control tower editor-writer. So anyhow, A Samurai's Day was the first project that they worked on that eventually became Seven Samurai. And A Samurai's Day was going to be about a particular individual samurai who at a certain point fails in his work, in his job, as it were, and commits suicide. And so it would be this day that ends in death in the life of a samurai. And this project, which went a long way with incredible historical research, because we learn from Hashimoto that Toho Studios, would send the production designers, costume designers, set designers off on the most incredible work of going to museums, libraries, archives, talking to history professors to make sure of the veracity of historical detail. And the problem with this project, Samurai's Day, is that it all hinged on a scene in the middle of the film where the samurai has lunch with his friend. And one of the workers and advisors on the film said, well, there was only 2 meals a day in that particular moment of Japanese history, and he wouldn't have had lunch. And this was enough to sink the project, because Hashimoto was really scared that if, after the beginning of his international success, if he was to make a film in which critics came along and said, oh, this is completely unbelievable because he wouldn't have had lunch, this would destroy Kurosawa's career. This was a real fear that they had. So that was the end of that project. Then they got to a project which was had the working title of The Lives of Japanese Swordsmen. And here was where Hashimoto pulled out one of his favourite books of legends and stories and tales of the samurai, historical tales, historical legends of the great samurai, which includes, for instance, the story which became the introduction of Kanbei in this film, the the samurai who disguises himself, who cuts his top knot, who dresses as a monk and goes in and saves a child. Right. So that was one of the legends that had been collected in a book, an ancient book that Hashimoto got out of the library and started working. In 15 days, he had written The Lives of Japanese Swordsmen, which was going to be an anthology film, an episodic film, working through, 7 or 8 stories of different samurai. So he did that script and handed it to Kurosawa, who read it in front of him, and at the end sort of, said, basically, it doesn't work because after all, we need Kisho Tenketsu. Let me read from the book what this means. Kisho Tenketsu, a venerable piece of scenario terminology, referred to the introduction, ki, development, sho, climax, ten, and conclusion, ketsu. The term itself, however, was musty, so we said start, development, climax, and last, using the English words. Since these were divided and placed into 4 boxes, we called Kisho Tenketsu the 4 boxes, or even the big box, as in what happened to the big box, or how's the big box? In any case, it meant that the structure, assemblage of a scenario had 4 indispensable elements and stages. And Hashimoto writes, with a self-deprecating, bitter smile, Mr. Kurosawa said, trying to string together climaxes from beginning to end to make a movie was woefully wrong-headed in the first place, I guess. So that's the end of The Lives of Japanese Swordsmen. But when they hear, as in a report on other historic research being done for these projects, the samurai project, when they hear about the wandering samurai who would occasionally protect farmers in an agreement to protect farmers, then they knew they had a story. They had, as Hashimoto and Kurosawa agreed, they had both a story and a theme, a story and an idea in the one sentence. Farmers are protected by samurai. And it was from that point that they began to work on it. Now, there's another very important thing in Hashimoto's book. The book is fascinating because it's not entirely praising of Kurosawa at all, even though it's full of admiration and even love for Kurosawa. And we go through a long, long span of years of their collaboration. But for Hashimoto, Kurosawa really lost something in his career when he stopped using this method of the first draft and then reworking subsequent drafts in a group, because at a certain point, in fact, after Seven Samurai, Kurosawa used a more sort of efficient, time-efficient method, is that a whole lot of writers would get together and write one draft together. The first draft was the final draft, and that's what would go into production, more or less. And as far as Hashimoto is concerned, this led to a real downturn across the films I Live in Fear, Throne of Blood, The Lower Depths, The Hidden Fortress, The Bad Sleep Well. This for him was a real downturn in Kurosawa's career. Of course, not every Kurosawa fan would agree with that. But I think it can be argued along Hashimoto's line that those films are not as densely and systematically constructed as Seven Samurai is, or Ikiru or Rashomon. Now, there's a very particular story that Hashimoto tells, which is that at a certain point, feeling rather proud of himself, the young Hashimoto thought, when they're working on Seven Samurai, they're about to work on it, and he thinks, I am now a better scriptwriter than Kurosawa. Not a better filmmaker. Later, Hashimoto would get more involved in production, but as purely as a scriptwriter, he thought he had already surpassed Kurosawa. But on the first day of the sort of table work, he noticed that Kurosawa had a notebook with him, a notebook that was full of drawings and various kinds of annotations devoted to each of the main characters. Right, there was a portrait of each main character, which Kurosawa had already been thinking deeply about, how to characterize them, how to show them, how to dress them, what their postures would be, what their gestures would be, what their past was, and so on. And this is like a blinding moment of revelation for Hashimoto, because he realises he's still a long way behind Kurosawa. He'll never be at Kurosawa's level, because Hashimoto couldn't do that. He couldn't have done this notebook of drawings and annotations for each character. Kurosawa had already gone so deeply into the characterization and the cinematic depiction of those characters. And of course, all of this detail would then feed into the scripting of each scene. And so Hashimoto realizes that he'll never have the complete vision that Kurosawa had at this sort of high point, this high moment of his career, in which everything was foreseen in the production of the film. And let's point out, by the way, that this was an enormously big budget production. I mean, it's one of the most expensive productions in Japan at the time. And of course, it's enormous running time, its length. All of this was unusual. Now, this is one of my most favourite parts of Seven Samurai. Kyuzo says, I'll go get those guns. And he disappears. Now, incredible ellipsis. And there are so many ellipses, like jumps in time, in the film, as scholars, including David Desser, have pointed out. We often come in the middle of a scene, of an action in this film, and sometimes we merely get a report of something that we haven't seen, right? Something is quickly narrated for us that we haven't seen. This happens not quite systematically. It's not like every scene, but there are dozens of examples of really, really strong ellipses where we jump from one thing to another, and either we find ourselves in the middle of something that's already unfolding, or we have something to learn. Now here, ellipsis is joined to the question of what's visible on screen and off screen. And so Kyuzo has run away into the mist, and we don't follow him. What we do see is his return. Absolutely great, right? Now, I love this scene, and I must say I loved it when I saw it in Mad Max Fury Road, because exactly the same thing happens in Fury Road, that at a certain point Max says, I'll go and do that battle, and we don't follow him. We merely see his heroic return, heroic but exhausted return, just as we see it here, that Kyuzo returns, hands over the weapon, and goes to sleep. He needs to conserve his energy. And this is such a wonderful moment in the film, where Katsushiro, expresses his great regard for Kyuzo. Kyuzo couldn't care less, or at least he's making a show of he couldn't really care less to be told that he is really great. And when the young man leaves, there's this marvellous expression on Kyuzo's face, which is kind of like, what the hell? Like, what nonsense it all is. But perhaps mixed with a sense of, okay, I am great. I mean, it's all there, right? And so much of the character of Mad Max in the George Miller films is already there in Kyuzo. Now, let me just say that I think that of all of the filmmakers that have been influenced by Kurosawa, I think George Miller may be the one who took the most, who learned the most in terms of all of these things we're talking about, the musicality of form, the depiction of an individual and a mass of people, different versions and variations on heroism, all of this stuff which is in the Mad Max series. When Miller started that series, he was not very conversant, or maybe not conversant at all, with Kurosawa's films. But then by the time he got the Mad Max 2, in the early 80s, people had told him, your film is like a samurai film. Mad Max is like a samurai figure. And that got him interested. So I think of all of the filmmakers, we can talk about Francis Coppola, we can talk about Spielberg, we can talk about Scorsese, many directors who've taken something from Kurosawa. But I think George Miller may have taken the most, and not only for the Mad Max films, by the way. Now, speaking of Mad Max films, that series by George Miller has often been compared to the great template of the American Western. And Seven Samurai 2 not only gave rise to a Western remake, The Magnificent Seven, that I won't say anything about here. It's not a patch on what Kurosawa did. But it's also been suggested that Kurosawa was very influenced by John Ford and the American Westerns that come through Ford and many other filmmakers in America. Now, I think I agree with Joan Mellon on this point in her BFI Classics book. I think the Western has very little to do with Seven Samurai. I think to understand the difference, we have to look at the broad historical context, because I think there are two things that are similar between the sort of American Western template and Seven Samurai. And those two things are, firstly, that we have, people in a village, a small town, a farming community who are protected by gunmen against various marauding bandits of various kinds. And so there's that basic sort of protection situation. And then there is the idea that we can see in an American Western like Shane by George Stevens, of this sort of melancholic idea that once the hero, the fighting hero, has protected the normal people and helped to save this civilization, they no longer have a function. They disappear into the horizon. They're not part of the community that they help protect. And there's something related to that, but entirely within the Japanese historic context, that we see at the end of Seven Samurai. So there are those two elements for sure. But the whole historic context is completely different, because in American Westerns we have the question of a so-called pioneer civilization. Well, rather it's a settler civilization, sort of white civilization that, does its best to displace the indigenous population and sort of founds a new civilization. And, hundreds of American Westerns are at one level, explicitly or implicitly, about that, about the founding of a settler civilization out of what is regarded as the wilderness, even if it's in fact already populated indigenous culture and world. Now, the Japanese situation that's referenced in Seven Samurai is completely different. It's not in any sense a pioneer or a settler civilization that's being fought for. And of course, there are no indigenous population as such to be displaced. What we have is sort of the collapse of one social order, the feudal order, and then we have this period of confusion, of chaos, of ruin, of recklessness, of lawlessness for more or less 100 years before another kind of order is established. Now that's such a huge difference with the American Western. At that level, there's really no comparison between Seven Samurai and the American Westerns. Doubtless, Kurosawa liked some American Westerns, and he may have taken this or that bit of inspiration from them, and in the presentation of action, and so on and so forth. But even when it comes down to the action scenes, there's so much very particular detail about, as we were discussing, the technology of weaponry and all this kind of stuff. Now, some American Westerns are also about that. Winchester 73 is about the technology of the rifle and the changing times and all that kind of stuff. But this is so imbued in its Japanese historic context that that finally there is not much of a fertile connection or networking between American westerns and Seven Samurai. I fully accord with Joan Mellon on this point. In terms of this film's influence on other films, we've just seen another one of the markers of that influence. When Kanbei is, marking off the list of enemies killed, which in his context, in the context of his character and in the context of this plot, we really don't blink at that. It's part of the general sort of mapping out, the planning that he does. He needs to keep track. They all need to keep track of how many of the 40 enemies are dead. They've got to know how many are left at any one moment. So it becomes an intrinsic part of the film that a list where you mark off the dead it works. It's funny that when we get to a filmmaker like Quentin Tarantino and a film or two films, the Kill Bill cycle, there it has to be made almost a gag that the main character has a list of the people that she is going to find and kill. And that she needs this list of whatever half a dozen names. It becomes a sort of an excessive, ironic, sort of playful thing that a character would keep a revenge list of that sort. But of course, in a film like Kill Bill, and in many of the Hong Kong action movies that inspired Tarantino, we see the definite influence of Kurosawa and his various action movies. Now, I've made mention earlier of the sort of changing critical fortune of this film, and it's intriguing that, if we look to the tradition of French film criticism, Cahiers de Cinema magazine and so on, if you look at the year in which Seven Samurai was released in France, 1956, none of the Cahiers de Cinema critics nominate Seven Samurai as one of the best films of that year. Only Ado Kiru, the famous surrealist, who later became a filmmaker as well, and who wrote for the other French film magazine, Positif, he was the only person in 1956 who put Seven Samurai in his best 10 films of the year list. And that's intriguing because in that moment in French film culture, there was a lot of interest in growing interest in Mizoguchi. The discovery by the French of Ozu took a bit longer, and Naruse even longer. But the Kurosawa cult had not really begun, at least for that particular sector of French film critics at that time. In 1957, as I mentioned, in Positif magazine, the Iranian film critic and very important filmmaker in the 60s and 70s, Farrokh Ghaffari, he wrote a long essay looking at Kurosawa's career to that point. And here's what he says about Seven Samurai, that it's admirable for its violence, the violence of its characters, the suppleness of the film's execution, the vitality of its music, and the plastic beauty of its images. Seven Samurai seems to us a summit of cinema spectacle. Right? So that's a very important way, I think, of honouring this film, to say, yes, it's spectacular cinema. It's the summit of spectacle cinema. Ghaffari goes on. Everything raises our admiration, from the splendid marching back and forth of the warriors up to the point of the final battle, going through the different episodes, love scenes, attack on the camp, and so on. The film has a stylistic refinement, which we notice in details such as the rain that falls ceaselessly. And in this, Kurosawa makes his link with an element of nature which we see in his other work, Judo Saga Rashomon. Now, this is very interesting. Ghaffari says the synthesis of the two tendencies of Kurosawa, and he sees the two tendencies as a social tendency, a social humanity, and sort of reckless adventure, which is more individualistic. These two tendencies are brought together in incredible tracking shots, in the evolution of the characters and their movements, their cries, their falls, and what Ghaffari gets to is that, there's an incredible oscillatory sort of physicality of the film, very liberated, that makes us think of Douglas Fairbanks. So once again, this relation to silent cinema and to adventure cinema, Douglas Fairbanks, or even better, L'Âge d'Or. That's Buñuel and Dali's L'Âge d'Or. So you see a very Positif magazine, a very Ado-Kiru inspired sort of combination there of loving popular entertainment, spectacle cinema, and combining that with a sense of liberation, this sort of liberating violence, and so on. Then there's a quote from Jay Lader from Film Culture magazine, the American magazine. Ghaffari says, Jay Lader, the remarkable historian and American critic who has seen the complete version of the film, could say, considering the unusual length of this movie, it's interesting to note that it contains no useless details. There is not a shot or a superfluous gesture, not a detail, which does not contribute to the tension of the whole film. And that was written in '56 by Jay Lader, indeed a very important and famous historian of cinema. Ghaffari goes on to discuss an aspect which he thinks in '57 had been overlooked, the philosophy of Zen Buddhism, which has an essential influence on the chivalric art of Japan, this knightly tradition of the samurai story. Entire generations of samurais have followed this teaching of Zen Buddhism, and its transposition onto the cinematic plane it should not be ignored in studies of sword films, of sword fight films. And then Ghaffari refers to the descriptions that are offered in what he calls a curious little book by E. Herigal, which is Zen in the chivalric art of combat. And then there are quotes about, the contained, the controlled samurai whose gesture is not even premeditated. It's so deeply inside him that when he must act, the act is instantaneous. It comes out of this deep sort of meditative interior. This is a quote from this book of '55. The samurai secretly observes his adversary, but then he puts it out of his mind. It's like he absorbs the manner, the style, the bearing of his enemy, the better to eventually fight him. Ghaffari talks about Kambei, the tranquil Kambei. Is full of reserve, calm, and modesty. And that's compared to the turbulent Kikuchiyo. So that's interesting. In '57, that's some of the early critical praise for Kurosawa. Okay, now let's have a look at these incredible action scenes here. And as I mentioned before, note this difference between, on the one hand, the samurai and the villagers who are on the ground, on foot, the bandits who are on horses, and once again the difference between the gun of the enemy, which is never seen, and for instance the bow and arrow of the samurai, which of course we see in loving detail. And this is something that Miyazaki spoke about with Kurosawa 40 years later. The details of how the samurai drew the arrow out from its casing and fired it, which was, meticulously researched by Kurosawa and his incredible team, of whom we must definitely mention the person in charge of art direction, Takashi Matsuyama, because it was such an integrated team at Toho at this time, and of course everything was put at the service of Kurosawa, who, as Hashimoto reminds us, he was no longer just Kurosawa of Japan at this time. He was Kurosawa of the world. He was the great ambassador of Japanese cinema abroad, outside of Japan, which at that time, early 50s, couldn't be said of yet of Ozu, of Mizoguchi, definitely not of Naruse. There was plenty of Japanese cinema which was entirely sort of local in its effect and in its audience. But Kurosawa, got special privilege because of the international effect of Rashomon in particular. That's what made the big change, and it's what made everybody super aware, including Kurosawa himself, of the need to succeed with this film, Seven Samurai. I mean, it had to be a hit, a commercial hit. And later in his career, Kurosawa did suffer from, having box office failures, which, he took very badly, and he took it as a sign that he was on a wrong path, or he needed to change his style or his approach in some way to get back, the audience that he had won in the early 50s, and more so with this film than with any other. Now, I've mentioned on several occasions the book by the co-writer Shinobu Hashimoto, his book Compound Cinematics, and I just want to conclude my line of references to that book by pointing out that even though Hashimoto thought that Kurosawa actually did lose his way after this film for quite some years by using this, the one draft is the final draft, new method of scripting where everyone had to work together on the first sort of draft where everything was stuck in. Hashimoto thought that Kurosawa really did lose a lot of the effectiveness and brilliance of his work. But it's fascinating to know that later, in 1961, when Hashimoto saw Yojimbo, he thought this was a resurgence. Not a resurgence of exactly the same Kurosawa. And across the films Yojimbo, Sanjuro, High and Low, and also to some extent Redbeard, what Hashimoto thought is that Kurosawa reached a different level where he was no longer so steeped in historical realism, naturalism of detail, verified detail, that in a way he'd got to a sort of a playful level where everything was obviously a kind of a fantasy, kind of obvious artifice, obvious fiction, and that the films addressed themselves to the viewer in that way. They immediately allowed the audience to sort of suspend disbelief, to suspend certain ways of viewing sort of former Kurosawa masterpieces, and that they could enter into this more sort of playful, even more comic book approach to these other kinds of entertainment action films that he was making. And so Hashimoto saw this as a revival in Kurosawa's career, which then sort of he lost again, when partly through the problems in his own life when he was basically kicked off the film Tora, the big international co-production, and Kurosawa faced a suicidal moment in his life. He faced great despair, sort of professional despair, and then in a sense the art film period, and also the period where people like Coppola and George Lucas and that are sort of coming in to help him at the level of financing and so on. We start the period of Dodeska Den, Desu Uzala, which was shot in Russia, Kagamusha, Ran, Dreams, and then the two final films, Rhapsody in August and Matadeo. And that is a different Kurosawa again. That's a sort of, in a way, into more art house, the art film Kurosawa. Definitely when we come to a film like Dreams, which Hashimoto thinks is the last really great film by Kurosawa, because it's where he totally stepped forward and said, "This is me. This is my dreams." Right? There was no longer hiding behind characters. There was this pure sort of projection from the unconscious into his art. And after that, Hashimoto said he didn't need to see any more films that Kurosawa made after that. They were sort of useless to watch after the summit of Dreams. Okay, now we're in this very intense part of the film where, of course, it's the final night before the final battle in the early morning. It's the time of warrior's rest, to use that cliched expression, in which some of the fighters need their sleep. But when it comes to our young hero Katsushiro, it's going to be the consummation of the desire between himself and Shino. While meanwhile her father Manzo is wandering around looking for her. And there's going to be, of course, the elided sex scene, but of course highly suggested sex scene between them. Now, as Joan Mellon and others have pointed out, this is not a romantic consummation. It doesn't lead to a romantic conclusion or a future in which samurai and villagers can be united, which, it might be in an imaginary, romantic comedy, for instance, or any number of stories. In fact, it's going to be what kind of splits them. Well, really, it's the ultimate victory of the villagers that splits apart the lovers, and that's part of the very ambivalent and complex emotions that arise in the very last minutes of the film. But at this point of the film now, we're sort of dealing with, as is explained by one of the samurai, the emotions that are released at this point, which is possibly the point before death, right? They could all be dead tomorrow. And so we have this explosion of desire, explosion of lust, an explosion of all kinds of feelings here. And it's part of the whole musical and dramatic construction of the film. We're going to have quite a long time devoted to this moment of pause, this moment of rest before the final battle. It all relates to that seesawing, that dialectic between the waiting and the action, the waiting and the fighting that I've mentioned several times. And of course, we wonder, at this point, how many of the samurai will survive the final battle. As it turns out, of course, 4 of them will die, all up. Which is a rather high figure out of 7. Now, I've mentioned before the role of onlookers, and usually multiple onlookers, crowds, in Seven Samurai. It's intriguing that this sexual relationship between Katsushiro and Shino is often given, as it were, to a privileged onlooker. It's glimpsed by one person, whether it's Kiyozu or the father here, Manzo. Why is that? It's because, of course, it's a very intense social question of shame. As the father will say rather soon, a farmer's daughter shouldn't go with a samurai. And when some of the samurai try to talk some sense into him later, they make the good point that, at least it wasn't a bandit that she had sex with. However, this does not much for the mood of the father here. So it's intriguing to me that the question of sexuality, of desire, of sexual release, even that has to be configured by Kurosawa within the social context, within the social system, the immediate social system of the villagers and the samurai. It's quite a wrenching scene, this one. The complete disregard or contempt of the father for his own daughter in this scene. Now, I want to go back at this point to talking about the somewhat shifting place of Kurosawa and of Seven Samurai in the canon of world cinema, and refer again to Chris Fujiwara's article, Canon Fodder. And in this article, he makes the point that, I'm quoting, in the late 50s and early 60s, Akira Kurosawa was one of the directors, with Michelangelo Antonioni, Federico Fellini, Ingmar Bergman and Satyajit Ray, whom Anglo-American critics used to prove to the intellectual establishment that films were art. This meant, to those who considered the exercise worthwhile, that he dealt with themes that any English professor could certify as important, and that his films were so obviously stylised that no one could doubt in them the presence of an artist. A little later, Fujiwara writes, "Okay, Seven Samurai is no argument a great film, but that means what exactly? Perhaps this: from a simple story of immense resonance, Kurosawa has crafted a highly legible entertainment." Now, as you'll soon hear, legibility is not necessarily a token of praise from this particular critic. He goes on, "Legibility is what Kurosawa is all about. Nothing in Seven Samurai reaches the screen without having gone through a massive simplifying process, which produces a film that's all overpowering verticals and horizontals, drawn out and reiterated effects, and one-note characterizations." He adds, referring to the love and support that Kurosawa received later in his life within American cinema, Fujiwara writes, "It's no wonder Spielberg and Lucas love Kurosawa so much. Seven Samurai, and at a much lower level, The Hidden Fortress, are prototypes for the kind of filmmaking with which the two Americans reinvented popular cinema, a style in which movement is constant, surface complexity readily grasped, and ambiguity minimised." And where the article ends is this: "The movie compels an admiration. It wastes no time getting to the main idea of each scene, and each idea adds to the meaning of the whole. The battle preparations are absorbing, and the visual force of the scenes of action and violence is undeniable. Through the performances of Takashi Shimura and Toshiro Mifune, Kurosawa makes Seven Samurai a logical and beautiful study of complementary tragic heroes. But within his work, Ikiru and High and Low offer more complex experiences and are relatively free of the director's greatest fault, which is his compulsion to give the audience as little choice as possible in reading visual information and interpreting a story." Well, I don't entirely agree with Chris Fujiwara there, but his point is well taken, and I think particularly in terms of thinking about how Kurosawa was taken up by his famous fans like Coppola, like George Lucas and so on, and sort of what that has meant for the way, many people now understand Kurosawa, the sort of the lens through which they see Kurosawa's films is through this lens of a contemporary American cinema, through Star Wars, through Mad Max, which of course came originally from Australia. They look at Kurosawa and they value the parts of Kurosawa that are, as it were, illuminated through that particular filter, through that particular lens. And in some sense, what I've been sort of arguing throughout this commentary is that we need to get back to a point where we're more immersing ourselves in the film as it is, on all of its levels and all of its structures and its expressive and eloquent effects. We have to try to value those for what they are within the film itself, rather than sort of bringing this later particular kind of canonisation of a certain aspect of Kurosawa's art. I mean, I too probably prefer, finally, Ikiru. But I also believe that Ikiru is a completely different film in Kurosawa's career to Seven Samurai. And once we pass over into this more action-based aspect of Kurosawa's work, I think the criteria for value sort of shift a little bit. And we don't have to go into, total simplification and legibility and these kinds of things which, are very appealing to a certain sector of the modern audience. It's, as it were, the American side of Kurosawa's art, or at least the side that seems to speak directly to the American cinema and certain traditions within American cinema. I think we can, each of us as a spectator can sort of try to clear away that fog a little bit and go right to the heart of what makes the film great. And so we move into the final battle. Of course, we have this, what everyone has mentioned in their accounts of this film, the rain. And when you think of the amount of rain that the crew of this film had to pump in to these shots, I mean, it really is astonishing. Some of you will have seen a well-known video essay, which is on YouTube online, where there's an interview with Robert Altman that's used, and Altman particularly loved this aspect of Kurosawa's work, which was the rain, and Altman has a really unusual take on it. He says that rain sort of draws us into the film. Rain makes us identify immediately, like we're in the scene immediately because of the rain. And although I can't entirely work out the logic of that thought, it's actually very close to Raymond Bellour's vision of the way a film works emotionally is through, various kinds of physical vibrations and this transmission of an energy, of a current. And if we think of rain in that way, that rain is one of these, as it were, agents of physical and emotional transmission from the screen to the viewer, then I start to understand what Altman meant by the importance of capturing rain, of bringing rain, of creating rain in a movie, which Altman himself did in a number of his own films. Now this fight scene, this battle scene, which is quite remarkable, as I mentioned before, it's a scene, of not only rain, of course, but of mud. And it's interesting to think of the mud in relation to blood. Now, there's actually very little blood in Seven Samurai. In later works, Kurosawa would experiment with stylisation of blood jets from the body and so on. In this film, there is very little blood. For whatever reason, Kurosawa, thought that perhaps because it's a black and white film, because he simply didn't want to make a big spectacle of blood, there were quite sort of bloodless deaths and fights, and sword spearings through the body. Very little blood attaches itself to these scenes. What you get here in this finale of the action is a sort of displacement from blood to mud. that it's sort of more shocking and it's more graphic in a sense to have the lines, the trails of mud, of muddy water on the faces and bodies of the samurai and of others. It's more graphic. It has more of an impact. It transmits more than any kind of mock-up of blood would be. This is clearly a decision that Kurosawa made. By the way, it's also worth putting in the detail here that from the dialogue between Miyazaki and Kurosawa in 1993, Kurosawa reveals there something that I've never read anywhere else, which is that Kurosawa talked about the limitations of optical soundtracks, which, even if you don't know much about film technique, if you've seen Walt Disney's Fantasia, you'll know that an optical soundtrack is actually, it's a thing that you can see, that it's a pattern on the film that creates sound. That is the sort of the encoding of sound. And Kurosawa was unhappy with the limitations of recording and mixing down to an optical soundtrack, partly because he said the cries, the screams, the cries of the samurai were not as sharp, as intense as he wanted them to be. And in fact, his response to that was to teach himself how to draw on the optical soundtrack, how to design the optical soundtrack to produce a better sound of crying, a better sound of screaming. Amazing. And he would present these designs to the sound technicians. And, okay, that's the scream, that's the cry I want right here. Amazing that he went that far with the technological research to stylize literally the optical soundtrack that far to create artificial sounds that would stand in that would replace what a human body could produce, and then what the film technology of recording and mixing could convey. So that's quite extraordinary, I think. Okay, we've had this succession of tragic and intense deaths in the film. And the rain is now, they're all up to their ankles in water. It's an extraordinary height of the spectacle, of melancholic spectacle, of exhaustion. I'd like to mention here a particular phrase from Jacques Loussel, who says that in Kurosawa, the question of endurance, of moral endurance and physical endurance, is the most important thing, and that the principal enemy of man, this is the way Loussel puts it, for Kurosawa, the principal enemy of man is discouragement and lassitude or fatigue. And so the battle scene is the monument, the testament to endurance. Okay, we've entered these very rich scenes that very many commentators have paused on, because we've just jumped from the height of despair, in a sense. Victory, but yet defeat in that the death of individual samurai, and we've passed to the ecstasy, the joy of the community. Led by Rikichi, he's leading the song. We have this great musical coming together of the villagers, and as Kanbei will eventually express, what this all means is that the villagers have won, the samurai have lost, and this is the reflection they have as they look upon the graves with the sword stuck in each mound, which of course is raised above in the image, the ordinary graves, as it were, of typical villagers. The graves of the samurai are more regal. Now we have this fantastic thing where the women sort of move into the shot, including, of course, Shino. And here we have the conclusion, which is, of course, a total non-resolution, in a sense, of the romance. It's the complete breaking off of any romantic connection between villager and samurai. And people have read in different ways the expressions of Shino in this scene. But for me, it's pretty clear that, she's, in a sense, she got what she wanted from him, and that's fine as far as it went. But now it's a new world for her. It's a new identity for her. She's part of the community. She's working in the community. She knows she's a villager, a farmer's daughter, and she's part of the collective. And she too has internalized that there is no future being with a samurai. So she seems to have completely blocked off this encounter in her life. It's completely in her past right now. And Katsushiro has to, who's still somewhat young and confused, is facing the befuddlement of this rejection in that sense. So what is, finally, to restate Fujiwara's question, what is the greatness of Seven Samurai? For me, it's quite clear. Here's a film which, on, you could say, the three main levels of cinema, which is the narrative level, the stylistic level, and then the semantic or thematic level, everything moves ahead in lockstep in this film. Everything is expressive and eloquent. Everything advances the story. Everything is meaningful. And everything is structured within an absolutely magnificent form and style. And really, what more could you ask from a single film?